The Making of a Narcissist. Traits, Triggers and Hidden Truths. By Margaret Light. Description: The Making of a Narcissist. Traits, Triggers and Hidden Truths delves into the complex psychology behind narcissistic behavior, exploring how early childhood experiences, emotional wounds and unmet developmental needs shape the persona of a narcissist. This insightful guide uncovers the dual identity of fragile inner selves hidden behind inflated masks, the patterns of entitlement, grandiosity and validation seeking, and the triggers that provoke rage or insecurity. By examining the relational impact on loved ones, and offering a compassionate understanding of these hidden truths, the book empowers readers to recognize, navigate, and heal from narcissistic dynamics while illuminating the path towards self-awareness and resilience. Chapter Outline. Introduction: The Mask Before the Mirror. Chapter 1: The Roots of Narcissism, Nature, Nurture, and the Early Void. Chapter 2: The Narcissistic Blueprint, Core Traits and How They Develop. Chapter 3: The Making of the Mask, How False Confidence is Constructed. Chapter 4: Emotional Triggers, What Sets the Narcissist Off. Chapter 5: The Power of Control, Why Narcissists Crave Dominance. Chapter 6: Love, Attachment, and the Desire to Possess. Chapter 7: The Relationship Illusion, Why They Attract and Harm Empaths. Chapter 8: The Hidden Shame, the Emotion Narcissists Never Show. Chapter 9: The Narcissist in Crisis, When the Mask Falls Off. Chapter 10: Variations of Narcissism, Beyond the Stereotypes. Chapter 11: Healing the Victims, Reclaiming Identity After Narcissistic Abuse. Chapter 12: Healing the Narcissist, Is Change Actually Possible? Conclusion: The Truth Behind the Mask. Introduction: The Mask Before the Mirror. Narcissism is a word that often travels with heavy baggage. It is tossed casually into conversations, sometimes used as an insult, sometimes as a diagnosis, and frequently misunderstood. Many people imagine a narcissist as someone who stares lovingly at their own reflection, brags endlessly, or dominates every room they walk into. But the truth is far more complex. Narcissism is not simply vanity or arrogance. It is an intricate psychological pattern shaped by temperament, experience, and emotional survival strategies. At its core, narcissism involves a fragile sense of identity that is held together by external validation. It is a mask, carefully constructed to protect a vulnerable interior. To understand narcissism clearly, it helps to begin by separating what we think it is from what it truly represents. A narcissist is not merely someone who has confidence or takes pride in their accomplishments. Confidence is grounded in reality, built on self-awareness, and able to withstand criticism without collapsing. Narcissism, on the other hand, is an inflated sense of self that depends on praise like a lung depends on air. When that praise is missing, the ego does not simply feel hurt, it feels threatened. Behind the bright surface lies a more complicated emotional landscape filled with insecurity, fear, and an aching hunger for admiration. This is why narcissism can feel contradictory from the outside. The person appears larger than life, yet their inner world is surprisingly fragile. A common misconception is that narcissism is the same as healthy self-esteem. In reality, these two states could not be more different. Healthy self-esteem is stable and flexible. It allows a person to acknowledge their strengths without denying their flaws. Someone with healthy self-esteem can take responsibility, apologize when wrong, and accept feedback without feeling annihilated. Narcissism, especially in its more harmful forms, is rigid and defensive. It is built on a relentless need to be superior, to avoid shame, and to escape the discomfort of vulnerability. Healthy self-esteem grows from self-acceptance. Narcissism grows from self-protection. There is also a crucial distinction between everyday narcissistic traits, which everyone has to some degree, and what psychologists refer to as narcissistic personality patterns. A certain level of self-focus, ambition, or desire for recognition is completely normal. Problems emerge when these traits dominate a person's inner life, and begin to damage their relationships, decisions, and emotional balance. When self-focus becomes the axis around which everything else must revolve, narcissism becomes more than a trait, it becomes a blueprint for survival. This book is built on a central premise: narcissists are not born. They are shaped. The development of narcissistic patterns is not the result of a single experience or one defining moment. Rather, it is the product of a complex combination of early environment, emotional wounds, learned coping strategies, and temperamental sensitivity. Some people develop narcissistic defenses because they grew up in environments where love was conditional or earned through achievement. Others were excessively idealized, praised not for who they were but for how they made their caregivers feel. Some experienced neglect, emotional unpredictability, or subtle forms of rejection that taught them to build a false self to survive. Even those who experienced trauma or instability may learn to cope by constructing a persona that feels powerful enough to mask their unmet needs. The mask is not formed from vanity, it is formed from pain. Understanding narcissism requires compassion, not the kind that excuses harmful behavior, but the kind that allows us to see the human complexity behind it. Narcissists often carry invisible wounds that were never acknowledged or healed. Their outward arrogance is frequently a way to conceal an inner emptiness or fear of unworthiness. This does not mean that their actions are harmless, or that the people around them should tolerate mistreatment. But recognizing the duality, the mask and the mirror, allows us to understand why narcissistic patterns emerge, and why they are so difficult to change. The mask represents who the narcissist wants the world to see. The mirror reflects the truth they cannot bear to face. Throughout this book, readers will be guided through the many layers of narcissistic formation and expression. You will learn how early relationships shape the emergence of the false self, and how certain temperamental traits make some individuals more vulnerable to developing narcissistic defenses. You will see how narcissistic behavior patterns manifest in everyday life: grandiosity, manipulation, entitlement, emotional detachment, and the desperate pursuit of admiration. More importantly, you will learn how these patterns affect those who live, work, or love in close proximity to a narcissist. Many people struggle to understand why interactions with narcissists feel confusing, draining, or destabilizing. This book will illuminate those dynamics and offer clarity where there has been emotional fog. You will also explore the relational impact of narcissism, how it shapes intimacy, communication, conflict, and attachment. Narcissistic relationships often follow predictable cycles that leave partners, family members, or friends feeling unseen, unheard, and unappreciated. Understanding these cycles can help readers protect themselves, set boundaries, and reclaim their sense of self. Rather than focusing solely on the pathology of narcissism, this book places equal emphasis on the experience of those who are affected by it. Healing is not only possible for individuals with narcissistic tendencies, it is also possible for those who have been hurt by them. Yet this book does not end with pathology or pain. It also offers hope. Narcissistic patterns, although deeply rooted, are not unchangeable. With insight, structured support, and a willingness to confront the underlying wounds, individuals can begin to soften the defenses that have shaped their lives. Healing is not about eliminating all narcissistic traits, but about building authentic self-esteem, developing emotional awareness, and learning how to connect with others without using the mask as protection. For those who love someone with narcissistic tendencies, healing also means rebuilding trust in themselves, recognizing unhealthy dynamics, and learning how to protect their emotional boundaries. In the chapters that follow, you will embark on a journey through the anatomy of narcissism, from its formation to its behavior patterns, from its impact on relationships to the pathways of healing for everyone involved. This introduction is only the doorway. Beyond it lies a deeper exploration of what it means to wear a mask, and what it takes to finally face the mirror. Chapter 1: The Roots of Narcissism, Nature, Nurture, and the Early Void. Narcissism does not appear fully formed in adulthood. It does not spring from a single moment of ego injury, or from one instance of mistreatment or praise. Instead, it grows slowly, silently, and often invisibly in childhood, woven into the emotional fabric of a developing self. To understand the adult narcissist, one must first understand the child they once were, a child navigating an environment that failed to meet their deepest needs, a child whose vulnerabilities were either magnified or ignored, a child who learned to survive not by being authentic, but by constructing a version of themselves the world would reward or at least not reject. This chapter explores that childhood world, its influences, its wounds, and the voids that shape the patterns we later call narcissism. Narcissistic traits often begin their journey in early relational environments, where the child feels unseen in ways they cannot articulate. That feeling of being unseen is not always the result of overt abuse or hostility. Sometimes it grows in homes that appear nurturing on the surface. It can develop in families that shower a child with praise but deny them emotional depth, or in parents who hover anxiously but fail to provide genuine attunement. The seeds of narcissism are planted not only in neglect, but also in imbalance: too much attention, too little support, too much expectation, too little acceptance. The roots sink deepest in homes where love is conditional, unstable, or tied to the performance of an idealized self. One common environment in which narcissism takes root is emotional neglect. Neglect does not always mean physical abandonment or absence of care. It can be far subtler, unfolding in families where parents are physically present but emotionally unavailable. A child learns early that their feelings are not reflected back to them, that their needs are not met with warmth or understanding, and that their inner world is not recognized. Without a mirror to show them who they are, they begin constructing an identity based on guesswork or survival instincts. They may learn to shut down their emotional needs because expressing them brings no comfort, only confusion or rejection. Over time, the child adapts by becoming self-sufficient in a way that is premature and unhealthy. They develop a shell that looks strong, but is built to protect an undeveloped core. This shell becomes the basis of the narcissistic false self. Inconsistency in caregiving is another powerful contributor to the development of narcissistic traits. When a child never knows which version of a parent they will meet, warm or cold, approving or condemning, they begin to develop hypervigilance. They scan for cues, adjust their behavior, and internalize the belief that they must perform correctly in order to receive love or avoid punishment. This unpredictability creates an emotional environment in which the child feels unsafe in their authenticity. They may cling to the persona that receives approval, with a desperation that later appears as grandiosity. The truth is that the child does not desire superiority, they desire stability. They want to know that they matter in a world that has taught them affection can be withdrawn at any moment. A less obvious but equally significant environment contributing to narcissistic development is the childhood defined by overpraise or excessive idealization. This is often misunderstood. The problem is not encouragement or celebration of achievements, but praise that is detached from reality and emotional connection. When a child is constantly told they are exceptional, perfect, or superior, without building the resilience and self-regulation that healthy development requires, they begin to equate their worth with an inflated identity. They are rewarded not for who they are but for who the parent wants them to be, often to fulfill the parent's own unmet dreams or emotional voids. The child becomes an extension rather than an individual. They learn to chase admiration, because it is the currency that secures parental approval. Beneath this inflated self lies a fragile identity that cannot tolerate criticism or imperfection. The child never learns to integrate failure into their self-concept, leading to the adult narcissist's hypersensitivity to perceived slights. There are also environments where the child is praised for their appearance or abilities, but not for their emotional experiences. They learn that their value lies in external qualities, rather than in their inherent humanity. The child internalizes the message that to be loved, they must be impressive, flawless, and constantly performing. These children grow up fearing moments of vulnerability because they were never taught that vulnerability is safe. They learn that emotions like fear, sadness, or confusion should be hidden or transformed into confidence, charm, or superiority. Their emotional development becomes stunted, and their sense of self becomes distorted around external markers of worth. Another fertile ground for the roots of narcissism includes families where the parent uses the child to meet their own unmet needs. In such families, the parent may appear deeply invested, affectionate, or involved, but the involvement is not truly about the child. Instead, the child becomes the emotional caregiver, the trophy, or the symbol of the parent's value. The child's role is to make the parent feel important, admired, or successful. The child learns that their own needs are irrelevant compared to the parent's emotional demands. They begin to suppress their genuine self to maintain harmony or approval, and this suppression drives the construction of the false self that later manifests as narcissism. Over time, the child's authentic emotions become foreign to them, replaced by a persona designed to keep the parent satisfied. All of these early environments contribute to emotional injuries that plant what can be called the narcissistic seed. These injuries often take the shape of unmet developmental needs that, if satisfied, would have allowed the child to grow into a secure and balanced adult. One of the most significant developmental needs is the need for attunement, the experience of being seen, understood, and emotionally mirrored by caregivers. Attunement teaches a child that their inner world matters, that their emotions have meaning, and that they are not alone in their emotional experiences. When attunement is missing, the child feels invisible. That invisibility becomes an emotional wound that later fuels the adult narcissist's desperate pursuit of admiration, attention, or dominance. The adult seeks externally what they never received internally. Another unmet need is the need for unconditional acceptance. Every child needs to feel that they are loved not for what they do, but for who they are. When acceptance is conditional, the child begins to believe that love must be earned. They develop the idea that their authentic self is not enough, and that a more impressive, more pleasing, or more perfect version must take its place. This belief forms the foundation of the narcissistic false self, a constructed identity that promises protection from rejection. The child's genuine feelings, fear, sadness, insecurity, are buried beneath layers of performance that later harden into narcissistic defenses. Children also have a developmental need for healthy boundaries. Boundaries help them understand where they end and others begin. In homes where boundaries are blurred or non-existent, the child may become enmeshed with the parent's emotions and expectations. They learn to tune out their own needs and focus on the parent's. This leads to identity confusion and emotional dependence. As adults, they may overcompensate by adopting rigid control over others, or by denying their own emotional needs entirely. The lack of boundaries in childhood creates adults who struggle to balance intimacy and independence, fueling the narcissistic cycle of idealization and devaluation in relationships. Another injury that contributes to narcissistic development is the experience of shame. Deep, pervasive shame that tells the child they are inadequate, unworthy, or defective. Shame often arises from subtle parental messages, not necessarily from harsh criticism. A child may be shamed for expressing emotions, for failing to meet unrealistic expectations, or for simply being different from what the parent desired. When shame is chronic, the child seeks ways to escape it. Narcissism becomes a shield against shame, a way to construct a self that cannot be hurt because it is not real. Grandiosity is not arrogance, it is an escape route. Entitlement is not pride, it is a compensation for feeling fundamentally deprived. The adult narcissist is often unaware that their behavior is driven by this early shame, because the false self has buried it deeply. All these childhood experiences distort identity formation. Identity is not simply a collection of beliefs about oneself, It is the emotional foundation upon which relationships, choices, and self-perception are built. When the foundation is cracked during childhood, the adult identity becomes unstable. The false self takes center stage, acting as a substitute for the authentic self that was never given room to grow. This false self becomes the narcissist's anchor, even though it is hollow. It gives them a sense of control in a world that once felt unpredictable. It provides a sense of superiority in a life that once felt small. It becomes the mask they cannot remove because beneath the mask lies the void formed by unmet needs. Identity formation is also distorted by the child's internalization of parental messages. If the parental message is that the child must be exceptional to be valued, the child internalizes the belief that their worth is tied to achievement. If the message is that emotions are dangerous or inconvenient, the child learns to suppress emotional expression. If the message is that vulnerability invites rejection, the child learns to armor themselves with perfection, charm, or dominance. These internalized messages become the blueprint for the narcissistic personality. They shape how the adult relates to themselves and to others. They determine how they respond to criticism, failure, intimacy, or vulnerability. One of the most profound distortions in identity formation occurs when the child becomes disconnected from their emotional self. Healthy development requires that a child learn to identify, express, and regulate emotions. But in many narcissistic development pathways, the child learns that emotions are unacceptable. They may be told explicitly not to cry, or they may receive subtle messages that emotional displays are weak or problematic. As a result, the child disconnects from their emotional experiences and learns to intellectualize or externalize them. This creates an adult who is emotionally underdeveloped, despite appearing competent or even charismatic. Their inner world remains frozen at the stage where emotional growth was interrupted. Another distortion arises from the child's need to maintain an idealized image to secure approval. This need fosters perfectionistic tendencies and a sense of constant performance. Children who grow up performing for love lose their ability to distinguish their authentic desires from the desires imposed upon them. They grow into adults who chase admiration because it is the only form of validation they understand. They fear failure because it threatens their entire self-concept. They struggle with authenticity because authenticity was never safe. These distortions shape the adult narcissist's relationship with themselves, making it nearly impossible for them to acknowledge vulnerability without feeling threatened. Ultimately, the roots of narcissism lie in the early void, a void created not by the absence of parenting, but by the absence of emotional nourishment. This void is what drives the adult narcissist's behavior. It is the emptiness they try to fill with admiration, control, accomplishments, or idealized relationships. It is the emptiness that fuels their defensiveness when criticized and their despair when ignored. It is the reason they cling to the false self so desperately. The void was formed long before they had the words to describe it, long before they understood what they were losing. It remains with them unless they are willing to confront the pain beneath the mask. Understanding this early void does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does explain it. It allows us to see the narcissist not as a villain, but as someone shaped by environments and experiences that distorted their emotional development. It helps us recognize that beneath the defenses lies a wounded child who never learned to feel secure, seen, or accepted. The adult narcissist lives with the legacy of that childhood, often unaware of its influence. This chapter illuminates how narcissism begins, not in malice but in misattunement, not in entitlement but in emptiness, not in superiority but in insecurity. By understanding the childhood roots of narcissism, we gain insight into the adult patterns that emerge later. We begin to see that the narcissistic personality is not a product of selfishness alone, but of developmental injuries that were never healed. The journey through narcissism's formation invites us to explore the deeper layers of the human psyche, where the mask meets the mirror, and where the early void shapes a lifetime of emotional struggle. Chapter 2: The Narcissistic Blueprint, Core Traits and How They Develop. To understand narcissism as more than a caricature of arrogance and self-absorption, it is essential to look closely at the underlying structure that shapes the narcissistic personality. This structure, what can be called the narcissistic blueprint, is not simply a collection of traits but an intricate emotional architecture constructed over years of adaptation. Every trait commonly associated with narcissism, whether it appears grandiose or cold or demanding, originated as a response to emotional conditions the child could not control. These traits were not chosen but formed as survival mechanisms, each serving a purpose in protecting the fragile inner self. In this chapter, we examine these core traits, how they develop, and why they remain so compelling for the adult narcissist, despite often causing emotional harm to themselves and others. To understand the narcissistic blueprint, one must first recognize that it is built on two parallel realities: the inner world and the outer world. The inner world is a landscape of fear, insecurity, shame, and unmet needs. This inner reality is often deeply buried, sometimes inaccessible even to the narcissists themselves. In contrast, the outer world is the domain of the false self, the persona designed to mask the vulnerability within. This persona is polished, inflated, and carefully constructed to ensure admiration, control, and safety. The dance between these two selves explains much of narcissistic behavior. The outer mask exists to guard the inner fragility, and every core trait serves this singular purpose. One of the defining traits of narcissism is entitlement. Entitlement is often misunderstood as simple selfishness, but within the narcissistic blueprint it has a much more complex meaning. The narcissist does not necessarily believe they deserve special treatment because they view themselves as inherently superior. Instead, entitlement arises from a deeper emotional wound. As children, many narcissists learned that their needs were either overindulged in inconsistent ways or dismissed altogether. In the case of overindulgence, the child was conditioned to expect constant gratification. In the case of neglect, entitlement became a compensatory belief that they must claim what was never given. Entitlement becomes a psychological armor, a way of asserting control in a world where their needs once went unmet. To the narcissist, entitlement is not a luxury but a necessity, a defense against the fear that they will once again be denied or overlooked. Another cornerstone of the narcissistic blueprint is grandiosity. Grandiosity is often mistaken for confidence, but whereas confidence is rooted in self-acceptance, grandiosity is rooted in self-protection. Grandiosity emerges when a child learns that their true self is insufficient in the eyes of their caregivers. Instead of being valued for their inherent worth, they may have been valued for their achievements, their appearance, or their ability to meet others' needs. The child comes to believe that they must shine brightly to earn love, attention, or safety. Grandiosity thus becomes an emotional strategy, a way to distance themselves from feelings of inadequacy. The adult narcissist carries this strategy forward, inflating their importance, exaggerating their abilities, and seeking roles or situations that reinforce the narrative of exceptionalism. This inflation shields the person from confronting the insecurity they have buried beneath the surface. Lack of empathy is another core trait within the narcissistic blueprint, but it is often misunderstood. Narcissists are not incapable of empathy, they are selectively empathetic. They can understand emotions intellectually, and may show empathy when doing so benefits their image or serves their goals. The problem lies not in comprehension but in prioritization. For the narcissist, emotional attunement to others threatens their internal equilibrium. To connect deeply with another person's emotions would require facing their own emotional vulnerability, something their inner structure cannot tolerate. The lack of empathy is therefore not a moral failing, but a psychological adaptation. If the child learned that emotions were unsafe, ignored, or punished, then emotional disconnection becomes a survival mechanism. Over time, This disconnection hardens into the adult narcissist's emotional shallowness or inability to respond compassionately. The absence of empathy is not a void, but a barrier constructed to protect a fragile self. Another trait central to the narcissistic blueprint is validation hunger. This trait is one of the most important because it fuels so much of the narcissist's behavior. Validation hunger is the insatiable need for external approval, admiration, or affirmation. For someone with healthy self-esteem, praise is pleasurable but not essential. For the narcissist, validation is oxygen. It sustains an identity that cannot stand on its own. This craving originates in the child who experienced inconsistent or conditional love. They learned that validation was unpredictable and that they needed to work for it constantly. As adults, they continue to pursue validation with intensity, often manipulating others to ensure a steady supply. Compliments, attention, accomplishments, and admiration all become forms of emotional fuel. This hunger never feels satisfied because it is rooted not in desire, but in deprivation. No amount of praise can fill the void created in childhood, and so the cycle of seeking validation becomes endless. These core traits, entitlement, grandiosity, lack of empathy, and validation hunger, may appear harmful or dysfunctional from the outside, but within the narcissistic psyche, they feel necessary for survival. This is a critical point. The narcissist does not wake up each morning plotting to manipulate, dominate, or hurt people. Instead, they operate within a psychological structure that demands these behaviors in order to maintain equilibrium. Their actions are often defensive rather than offensive. Entitlement protects against deprivation. Grandiosity protects against shame. Lack of empathy protects against vulnerability. Validation hunger protects against emotional collapse. Every trait that seems destructive externally is serving an internal purpose. Without these defenses, the narcissist fears they will be overwhelmed by feelings they cannot manage. This explains why narcissistic individuals often respond so defensively to criticism or perceived rejection. Such moments threaten the entire structure of their personality. The false self, the outer mask, relies on a steady stream of reinforcement. When that stream is interrupted, the inner wounds become exposed. The narcissist may react with rage, denial, or withdrawal, because the alternative is facing a part of themselves that feels unworthy, inadequate, or defective. The intensity of their reactions is a reflection not of arrogance but of fear. Criticism does not simply challenge their behavior, it threatens their identity. This is one reason why narcissists often struggle to acknowledge mistakes or take responsibility. To admit wrongdoing would mean admitting imperfection, and imperfection would crack the mask that protects their inner fragility. This brings us to one of the most defining features of narcissistic personality structure, the dual identity. Narcissists live with two selves, the fragile inner self and the inflated outer mask. The fragile inner self is the self that never fully developed, the self that carries the weight of unmet needs, shame, fear, and emotional wounds. This self is deeply sensitive, easily overwhelmed, and often frozen at the emotional age when the injuries occurred. It is the part of the narcissist that feels empty, insecure, or invisible. The adult narcissist rarely accesses this inner self directly, because doing so would be too painful. Instead, they build and invest in the outer mask. The inflated outer mask is the persona crafted to navigate the world. It is confident, impressive, charming, knowledgeable, or powerful, whatever qualities are needed to secure validation and avoid vulnerability. This mask is both a shield and a projection. It shields the fragile self from emotional harm, and projects an image that compensates for the insecurities beneath. The narcissist does not simply present the mask, they identify with it. The mask becomes their sense of self, their emotional anchor. This explains why narcissists often seem disconnected from their own behavior. They genuinely see themselves through the lens of the mask. They believe they are as exceptional as the persona they present, because acknowledging the gap between the mask and the inner self would destabilize their entire identity. This dual identity creates a constant internal conflict. On one hand, the narcissist longs for genuine connection, affirmation, and love, but on the other hand, they fear these very things because connection requires vulnerability. Vulnerability would expose the fragile inner self, which they have spent a lifetime protecting. As a result, relationships become battlegrounds between their desire for closeness and their need for emotional self-preservation. They may crave intimacy but sabotage it when it threatens their sense of control. They may idealize partners and then later devalue them when the partner sees through the mask. They may seek admiration but react with defensiveness if someone offers constructive feedback. This internal conflict defines much of narcissistic behavior, creating a cycle of longing, fear, and avoidance that leaves both the narcissist and those around them emotionally exhausted. The dual identity also prevents emotional growth. Because the narcissist is so invested in preserving the outer mask, they rarely access the inner self long enough to process their emotional wounds. Growth requires introspection, vulnerability, and accountability, all things the narcissistic blueprint is designed to avoid. This does not mean narcissists cannot change. It means the path to change is difficult because it requires dismantling defenses that once protected them. For many narcissists, the idea of confronting the fragile self feels like a threat to their survival. The mask becomes not just a persona but a prison, locking them into patterns that may no longer serve them. Despite this complexity, the narcissistic blueprint is understandable when viewed through the lens of emotional adaptation. Narcissists develop these traits not out of malice but out of necessity. They learned early in life that authenticity was unsafe, that their emotions were unwelcome, or that they had to perform to feel valued. The narcissistic traits that frustrate and harm others today were once the child's best attempt at securing emotional survival. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does explain its origins. It allows us to see the narcissist not as a monster, but as a human being shaped by developmental wounds. Understanding the narcissistic blueprint helps illuminate why change is so difficult for narcissistic individuals. To let go of entitlement, they must confront the fear of deprivation. To soften grandiosity, they must face the pain of inadequacy. To develop empathy, they must reconnect with emotions they once suppressed. To reduce validation hunger, they must cultivate internal self-worth, something they have rarely experienced. To remove the mask, they must trust that their inner self is worthy of being seen. Each step requires confronting the very wounds their defenses were designed to protect. This chapter reveals that the core traits of narcissism are not isolated characteristics, but interconnected mechanisms that form a cohesive psychological structure. Entitlement, grandiosity, lack of empathy, and validation hunger all work together to support the dual identity that defines narcissism. These traits feel essential to the narcissist because in many ways they were essential for emotional survival in childhood. But what once protected the child now imprisons the adult, creating relational turmoil, inner emptiness, and cycles of behavior that prevent authentic connection. The narcissistic blueprint is not fixed, but it is deeply ingrained. It can be understood, explored, and even transformed, but only when the narcissist or those trying to understand them recognizes that beneath the mask lies a vulnerable self that learned long ago it was safer to hide than to be seen. Understanding this blueprint is the first step toward healing, whether that healing involves dismantling the false self or learning to navigate relationships with healthier boundaries. Chapter 3: The Making of the Mask: How False Confidence is Constructed. To understand narcissism at its deepest level, one must look not at the behaviors that draw so much attention, but at the emotional architecture that sustains them. Narcissistic behavior is often the outward performance of an inward fear, a disguise crafted to survive a world the individual perceives as unpredictable, rejecting, demanding, or emotionally unsafe. At the heart of this disguise is what psychologists call the false self, the mask. Chapter 3 explores how this mask is built, why it becomes central to the narcissist's identity, and how it shapes every aspect of the narcissist's relationship with themselves and others. The making of the mask does not occur suddenly. It is not a conscious decision or a deliberate choice. It is constructed gradually, beginning in childhood and refined throughout adolescence and adulthood. The child looks at their environment and learns quickly which behaviors bring approval and which bring criticism or indifference. In some homes, expression of vulnerability is met with dismissal. In others, achievement is the only path to affection. In some families, the child becomes the emotional caretaker, forced into premature maturity, praised not for their needs but for their compliance. Over time, the child begins to prioritize the traits that secure acceptance and suppress those that provoke discomfort. Slowly, a false identity forms, one that is designed not for authenticity but for emotional survival. This constructed persona becomes a protective shield, a means of navigating relationships and environments with as little emotional risk as possible. It is often mistaken for confidence, but in truth it is confidence borrowed rather than born. It is built from image, performance, and adaptation, rather than from self-awareness or inner stability. The persona may appear strong, certain, charismatic, or impressive, but beneath the surface lies a sense of self so fragile that it cannot tolerate exposure. The mask becomes both a refuge and a prison, shaping the narcissist's life in ways that are simultaneously empowering and deeply limiting. One of the central components of this mask is the development of performance-based worth. From an early age, many individuals who later develop narcissistic traits learn that their value is tied not to their inherent being, but to what they can do, achieve, or provide. They learn that affection is earned through performance, attention is gained through accomplishment, and acceptance is conditional upon presenting a certain image. Because of this early conditioning, the child begins to believe that their true self is inadequate or invisible. To survive emotionally, they create a self that can win the approval they crave. In adulthood, this performance-based worth manifests in numerous ways. The narcissist strives to excel, impress, dominate, or remain perpetually admired. They may become workaholics, perfectionists, charmers, or constant social performers, depending on the personality structure that developed in response to their early environment. They often feel compelled to maintain an image of strength or superiority, even when they feel overwhelmed or insecure. Their self-esteem becomes entirely dependent on the success of their performances, which means they cannot afford to fail, even privately. The pressure of sustaining this identity is immense, but abandoning it feels impossible because the authentic self beneath the mask was never allowed to develop fully or safely. The process of image management becomes central to the narcissist's life. They curate every aspect of their identity carefully: how they dress, how they speak, how they behave socially, and how they narrate the personal story. Perfectionism plays a significant role in this curation. For some narcissists, perfectionism is expressed through rigid control over their work, appearance, or external environment. For others, the perfectionism is more subtle, emerging as a need to be perceived as morally superior, uniquely talented, intellectually advanced, or emotionally untouchable. They shape their identity like an artist crafting a sculpture, not to reflect reality but to project an ideal. Charm also plays a powerful role in the creation of the mask. Narcissistic individuals often learn early that charm is a form of currency, a way to gain acceptance and disarm potential threats. Their charm is rarely accidental, it is learned through careful observation. The child who becomes a narcissist often learns to read the emotional cues of others, not for the purpose of empathy, but for the purpose of adaptation. They learned which behaviors elicited praise, which evoked affection, and which secured safety. As adults, they use charm strategically, deploying it in situations where admiration or influence is needed. Their charm can be magnetic, drawing people in with warmth, confidence, or charisma. But it is a charm rooted in performance, rather than in genuine emotional reciprocity. Curated identity is another crucial component of the mask. The narcissist engages in constant self-presentation, often shaping their public persona to appear flawless, impressive, or enviable. This curation can take many forms. Some narcissists create identities centered on career success, projecting an image of competence and authority. Others focus on physical appearance, meticulously maintaining an attractive or youthful facade. Some cultivate artistic, spiritual, or intellectual personas that elevate their status or provide a sense of uniqueness. Every aspect of their identity is filtered through the need to maintain the mask. The real self, with all its imperfections, uncertainties, and emotional needs, remains hidden because revealing it feels too dangerous. This meticulous construction of the mask raises an important question: why do narcissists fear authenticity? Authenticity requires vulnerability. It requires being seen as one truly is, without distortion or pretense. For most people, authenticity is challenging but possible. For narcissists, authenticity is terrifying. Their fear comes from early experiences where authenticity may have led to rejection, ridicule, invisibility, or inconsistency. The child learned that showing their true self resulted in emotional pain, so they developed a false self to protect that vulnerability. Over time, the false self becomes so dominant that the narcissist loses contact with the parts of themselves that were buried. Authenticity also threatens the narcissist's internal equilibrium, because the false self is not just a mask worn publicly, it becomes the foundation of their identity. To remove the mask would mean confronting a self that feels empty, underdeveloped, or unworthy. This confrontation is something the narcissist has spent years avoiding. It evokes deep shame, confusion, and emotional disorientation. The mask may be exhausting to maintain, but it is familiar and safe. The authentic self, in contrast, feels dangerous. Another reason narcissists fear authenticity is that authenticity invites intimacy, and intimacy invites accountability. Genuine relationships require mutuality, empathy, vulnerability, and emotional responsiveness, qualities that the narcissistic false self cannot sustain. When someone gets too close, the narcissist fears that the mask will crack and the fragile self will be revealed. This fear leads to defensive behaviors such as withdrawal, aggression, deflection, or devaluation. The narcissist pushes people away not because they do not want connection, but because they fear the consequences of being truly known. This fear of authenticity also explains the narcissist's hypersensitivity to criticism. Criticism threatens the mask by exposing imperfections or weaknesses. Even gentle feedback can feel like an attack, because it contradicts the carefully constructed identity the narcissist relies on. To protect the mask, they may react with rage, denial, projection, or self-pity. Criticism is not simply uncomfortable, it is destabilizing. It forces the narcissist momentarily out of the constructed persona and into contact with the vulnerable self beneath, which they experience as intolerable. The mask becomes a full-time identity because it provides the narcissist with the illusion of control. Control over how others perceive them, control over their emotional environment, and control over the narrative of their life. The false confidence that results from this mask is fragile but powerful. It allows the narcissist to navigate the world without confronting the parts of themselves they fear. Yet it also prevents them from forming genuine connections, experiencing emotional growth, or developing stable self-worth. The making of the mask also has profound consequences for how the narcissist relates to others. To maintain the mask, they often require others to serve as mirrors, reflecting back the image they wish to uphold. This dynamic turns relationships into tools for self-regulation rather than sources of mutual connection. Friends, partners, colleagues, or even children become extensions of the narcissist persona. They are expected to reinforce the narrative of superiority or exceptionality that sustains the mask. When others fail to fulfill this role, the narcissist may experience them as threats rather than companions. Because the mask must remain intact at all times, the narcissist invests tremendous psychological energy into sustaining it. This investment leaves little room for introspection or emotional honesty. The narcissist may even internalize the mask to the point where they no longer distinguish between the persona and the authentic self. They may believe that the curated identity is their true identity. This internalization deepens the disconnection from their genuine emotions, making it even harder to recognize or address their vulnerabilities. Yet beneath this carefully constructed mask lies a self that longs to be seen. The narcissist's inner child, buried under layers of adaptation, yearns for unconditional acceptance, emotional attunement, and genuine connection. But the mask prevents these needs from being met, because fulfilling them would require vulnerability. Therefore, the narcissist remains trapped in a cycle where they seek validation but fear the intimacy required to receive it. They strive for admiration, but avoid the authenticity that would allow them to experience love. They perform constantly, yet feel perpetually unseen. Understanding the making of the mask reveals a paradox at the heart of narcissism. The narcissist constructs the mask to protect themselves from pain, yet the mask becomes the source of much of their suffering. It isolates them from genuine experiences, disconnects them from authentic emotions, and perpetuates the very emptiness they are trying to escape. The mask provides safety but not fulfillment. It offers admiration but not love. It gives them control but steals from them the freedom to be real. In the end, the narcissistic mask is both a masterpiece and a burden. It is a masterpiece because it is constructed with extraordinary psychological ingenuity, shaped by years of learning, adaptation, and emotional negotiation. It is a burden because it requires constant maintenance and prevents the narcissist from ever truly resting in themselves. The mask reflects a brilliant survival strategy, but survival is not the same as living. The making of the mask is the story of a child who learned that authenticity was unsafe and created a persona to navigate the world. It is the story of an adult who now relies on that persona to maintain equilibrium. And it is the story of a human being who longs to be seen, but fears the exposure that seeing would bring. Understanding this mask not only deepens our comprehension of narcissistic behavior, but also prepares us for the deeper exploration to come. In the chapters that follow, we will examine how this mask influences relationships, fuels destructive patterns, and shapes the narcissist's emotional life. Chapter 4: Emotional Triggers: What sets the narcissist off? To understand narcissistic behavior at its deepest level, one must look beyond the surface of entitlement or pride and examine the emotional mechanisms that operate quietly beneath. Narcissists often appear explosive, defensive, reactive, or easily wounded, but these outward responses mask an inner world shaped by a fragile self-image and a complex relationship with vulnerability. Their emotional triggers are not random. They are the product of early experiences, internalized shame, and an identity that is held together by brittle defenses rather than genuine resilience. When something threatens the structure of their carefully constructed self, the reaction can be sudden, intense, and disproportionate. What appears as rage, disdain, or cold detachment is often the visible expression of an invisible injury. Rejection and criticism form the core of what psychologists refer to as narcissistic injuries. For most people, criticism may cause discomfort or defensiveness, but it does not threaten their fundamental sense of identity. In contrast, a narcissist experiences even mild disapproval as an existential threat. Their internal self-image is inflated but unstable, built on external validation rather than intrinsic worth. Because of this fragile foundation, any suggestion that they are flawed, mistaken, or inadequate can feel like a catastrophic assault. A simple "I disagree" may be interpreted as an attack on their competence. A request for accountability can feel like an accusation. Even neutral feedback may be twisted into evidence that they are being undermined or disrespected. This hypersensitivity to criticism is tied directly to the emotional wounds formed in their early development, where love may have been conditional, inconsistent, or lacking entirely. As a result, their adult self cannot tolerate the emotional discomfort that accompanies imperfection. Rejection functions similarly, but with an added layer of pain. To be rejected is to risk being exposed as unworthy, something the narcissist works tirelessly to avoid. Rejection reawakens the buried fear of not being enough, of being seen as flawed or insufficient. This is why narcissists often react to rejection with rage or dismissal. They may attempt to devalue the person who rejected them, rewrite history to maintain their superiority, or abruptly withdraw to protect themselves. What others perceive as callousness is actually a survival response to the unbearable experience of vulnerability. To acknowledge hurt would mean admitting weakness, and this is something a narcissist's emotional system resists fiercely. The mask cannot crack. The persona cannot falter. As long as they can maintain the illusion that they are unaffected, they can postpone the feelings they fear most. At the center of these reactions lies shame, a deeply rooted emotion that narcissists spend their lives trying to escape. Shame is not simply embarrassment or guilt, it is a painful conviction that one is fundamentally flawed. Many narcissists have spent their childhoods feeling invisible, unworthy, or conditionally valued. Instead of learning how to cope with shame in healthy ways, they learn to bury it under layers of grandiosity. But shame does not disappear just because it is hidden. It remains alive beneath the surface, always ready to erupt when triggered. This buried shame becomes the hidden fuel behind narcissistic rage, defensiveness, and emotional volatility. Shame is especially powerful because it threatens the narcissist's entire emotional architecture. Their inflated identity is a shield against the primitive fear of inadequacy, and any experience that hints at failure activates this deeply buried wound. When shame is triggered, the narcissist's emotional survival mode activates instantly. They may lash out to shift the focus away from their vulnerability. They may blame others relentlessly to avoid confronting their own role in a conflict. They may project their insecurities onto others, accusing someone of the very flaws they fear within themselves. These coping mechanisms allow them to push shame outward, rather than experiencing it internally. Narcissistic rage, often misunderstood as mere anger, is actually a defensive response to this intolerable shame. It is not the kind of anger that grows gradually, or can be reasoned with. It is sudden, intense, and all-consuming. In these moments, the narcissist is not simply reacting to what was said or done. They are reacting to what it symbolizes, the threat of being exposed. Rage allows them to momentarily regain a sense of power, restoring the illusion of control. It is a way of silencing the internal voice that whispers, "You are not enough." By attacking externally, they avoid collapsing internally. This cycle of emotional injury and external blame becomes a recurring pattern in relationships involving a narcissist. Because they cannot tolerate self-reflection that may challenge their self-image, they often place responsibility for their emotions onto others. If they feel hurt, someone must have intentionally caused it. If they feel insecure, someone must have triggered it. If they feel criticized, someone must be undermining them. This externalization of blame protects their fragile ego, but creates chaos in their relationships. Partners, family members, and colleagues may find themselves repeatedly accused of wrongdoing they did not commit. They may feel as if they are walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring their words to avoid triggering an eruption. Over time, this dynamic can drain emotional energy and distort communication. The narcissist, for their part, does not consciously choose this pattern. Much of it is automatic, shaped by their psychological defenses. Their emotional system is wired to avoid vulnerability at all costs, and their behavior reflects this imperative. It is important to understand that, beneath the outward aggression or cold detachment, the narcissist is often experiencing a sense of inner collapse. Their rage is a shield, not a preference. Their avoidance is protection, not indifference. But this does not lessen the impact on those around them. The people who love a narcissist often feel confused, hurt, or destabilized by the mercurial shifts in behavior. One of the most painful aspects of this cycle is the unpredictability. What triggers a narcissistic response one day may not trigger it the next. The reaction may vary depending on the narcissist's current emotional state, stress level, or sense of control. This unpredictability keeps others off balance, unsure of what will ignite the next emotional explosion. For those who seek peace, validation, or understanding within the relationship, this dynamic can be deeply distressing. It becomes difficult to build trust or closeness, because the emotional ground is always shifting. Despite the intensity of their reactions, narcissists rarely recognize their triggers for what they are. They may perceive themselves as victims of unfair treatment, convinced that the world is against them. Self-awareness is limited, because introspection threatens to expose the shame they work so hard to avoid. To acknowledge their triggers would require them to confront their vulnerabilities, and this is a task their defenses do not easily permit. Even when confronted with clear evidence of disproportionate reactions, they may dismiss or distort the situation to preserve their self-image. However, not all narcissists respond with overt rage. Some practice a quieter form of retaliation, such as withdrawal, silent treatment, or passive-aggressive behavior. This is often a way to regain control when direct confrontation feels too risky. By withdrawing affection or attention, they can punish the person they believe triggered their emotional discomfort without having to admit their vulnerability. Others may turn to manipulation, guilt-tripping, or charm to re-establish dominance. Whether the response is loud or quiet, the underlying pattern remains the same: an attempt to protect the fragile inner self from the threat of shame. Understanding these triggers is crucial for anyone who interacts closely with a narcissist. Knowledge does not eliminate the emotional impact, but it can offer clarity. Recognizing that a narcissistic eruption is often rooted in shame rather than genuine malice can help reframe the experience. It allows one to see the behavior as a symptom of a deeper issue, rather than a reflection of personal failure. But while empathy is valuable, it must be balanced with boundaries. Understanding a narcissist's triggers does not oblige anyone to tolerate harmful behavior or sacrifice their emotional well-being. For the narcissist, meaningful change requires confronting the very vulnerabilities they have spent a lifetime avoiding. This is neither simple nor easy. Healing involves developing the capacity to tolerate shame without collapsing or attacking. It requires learning how to separate identity from perfection, and how to process criticism without self-destruction. Therapeutic work can help them build emotional resilience, but only if they are genuinely willing to examine their defenses and question the illusion of the mask. This journey toward self-awareness is often long, and not all narcissists choose to walk it. Yet for those who do, it becomes possible to respond to emotional triggers with reflection instead of reaction. In the end, narcissistic triggers are windows into the emotional architecture of the narcissistic self. They reveal the fault lines beneath the mask and illuminate the internal conflict between the fragile true self and the constructed persona. When a narcissist reacts with rage or withdrawal, they are not simply defending their pride, they are defending the emotional scaffolding that holds their identity together. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior, but it does expose the complexity behind it. The mask may appear solid, but beneath it lies a terrain shaped by fear, shame, and a desperate need to protect the self from emotional harm. As long as these vulnerabilities remain unacknowledged, the cycle of injury and reaction will continue. But with awareness, honesty, and a willingness to confront the buried wounds, there is the possibility of change, both for the narcissist and for those who have been affected by their emotional storms. Chapter 5: The Power of Control: Why Narcissists Crave Dominance. To understand a narcissist is to understand their relationship with control. Control is not merely a preference for them, it is the cornerstone of their emotional stability, the anchor that keeps their fragile sense of self from drifting into chaos. Where most people can tolerate life's unpredictability and adapt to shifts in relationships, narcissists experience such unpredictability as a direct threat to their internal safety. Control becomes the mechanism through which they attempt to regulate their environment, their relationships, and most importantly, their self-image. Without control, their emotional world feels terrifyingly unstable. The need for dominance, therefore, is not born from pure arrogance or ambition, it emerges from deep psychological survival instincts. For the narcissist, control represents safety. A predictable, managed environment protects them from experiencing the emotions they fear the most: shame, rejection, inadequacy, and vulnerability. These emotions are linked to early life experiences where they felt emotionally unprotected, unseen, or conditionally valued. In childhood, they may have learned that losing control meant being hurt, dismissed, or ignored. The wounds may not always be visible or severe, but they imprint deeply. As adults, narcissists respond to any hint of emotional unpredictability with a powerful urge to dominate and regulate. They seek to shape the actions, thoughts, and feelings of people around them so that their own emotional equilibrium is never disturbed. Control becomes a psychological shield that prevents old wounds from reopening. This craving for control permeates every aspect of their relationships. It shows up in subtle ways at first, guiding conversations, influencing decisions, dictating preferences, but eventually it becomes the framework for how they interact with others. Their need to dominate does not always appear aggressive or obvious. In many cases, it is wrapped in charm, persuasion, and seeming confidence. They may present themselves as the strongest, the smartest, or the most capable person in the room. This facade allows them to maintain an elevated position where they cannot easily be challenged or questioned. The mask of confidence is designed to ensure they stay in control of how others perceive them and how interactions unfold. One of the primary tactics narcissists use to maintain control is manipulation. Manipulation for them is not always a conscious, calculated plan. Often, it is an instinctive method of shaping the environment to protect their self-image. They might subtly twist facts, rewrite history, or shift blame to keep themselves in a favorable position. They might offer affection, generosity, or attention only when it serves their goals. They may mirror someone's desires or values early in a relationship to build trust, only to later weaponize that trust for dominance. Manipulation is rooted in their belief that direct vulnerability is unsafe, influence must be gained indirectly. A narcissist rarely manipulates for pleasure alone. It is a strategic way to maintain emotional power and prevent circumstances from slipping beyond their control. Gaslighting is one of the most infamous manipulation tools used by narcissists, and it often becomes their preferred method for maintaining psychological dominance. Gaslighting involves creating doubt in another person's perception, memory, or emotional reality. Through denial, contradiction, or distortion, the narcissist gradually destabilizes the other person's sense of truth. This tactic serves several purposes. First, it prevents the narcissist from being held accountable. If the other person questions their own perspective, they are less likely to challenge or criticize. Second, gaslighting secures the narcissist's supremacy in the relationship. If they can dictate reality, they can dictate everything. Third, it ensures dependency. A gaslighted individual often begins to rely on the narcissist for clarity, approval, and validation. In this dependency, the narcissist feels safe from rejection because they have constructed a dynamic where they are needed, even if the need is artificially manufactured. Triangulation is another tactic narcissists rely on to maintain control. This tactic involves bringing a third party into a dynamic to create competition, insecurity, or confusion. The third party may be a friend, a colleague, a family member, an ex-partner, or even a fictional character fabricated to create emotional leverage. By positioning themselves as the central figure between two individuals, the narcissist reinforces their importance and power. For example, they may subtly compare their partner to someone else, praise another person excessively, or hint that others find them more desirable. Triangulation keeps the narcissist in a position of superiority because attention is centered around them, and those involved are kept emotionally off balance. The instability serves the narcissist's objectives. They remain the one who decides whom to please, whom to punish, and whom to prioritize. In a triangulated system, the narcissist retains complete control. Many narcissists also use emotional unpredictability as a means of dominance. They may shift between warmth and coldness, affection and withdrawal, praise and criticism. This inconsistency creates an unstable emotional environment that others feel compelled to navigate carefully. Over time, people around the narcissist may become conditioned to anticipate their reactions, constantly adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering an outburst or to regain lost affection. The narcissist remains firmly in control because others adapt to them, not the other way around. In this dynamic, the narcissist never has to compromise, negotiate, or accommodate emotional needs outside their own. The unpredictability keeps others seeking approval and reinforces the narcissist's power. What outsiders often find confusing is the intensity with which narcissists respond when they feel control slipping through their fingers. To many, the reaction appears excessive or irrational. But for the narcissist, losing control feels like psychological death. It threatens the foundation of their identity, which is built not on internal stability, but on external regulation. Without control, the narcissist is confronted with emotions they have spent their entire lives avoiding. Vulnerability becomes unavoidable. The facade may crack. Their sense of superiority may crumble. In such moments, their reaction may be explosive, desperate, or manipulative, not because they enjoy conflict, but because they equate losing control with losing emotional survival. When a narcissist feels that control is slipping, they may escalate their tactics dramatically. They may intensify manipulation, increase gaslighting, or turn to overt intimidation. They may express rage, make threats, or attempt to guilt the other person into compliance. Some narcissists may shift into victim mode, using self-pity as a form of emotional leverage. Others may disappear entirely, withdrawing affection or communication to punish the other person. These responses are attempts to regain dominance quickly and decisively. The narcissist's fear of losing control is so acute that they will resort to extreme measures to restore it. This fear often reflects early experiences where control was tied to emotional survival. Many narcissists grew up in environments where they learned that being vulnerable led to harm or neglect. They may have been shamed for expressing needs, punished for showing emotion, or forced to adapt to unpredictable caregivers. Control became a coping mechanism, a way to prevent emotional pain by anticipating or influencing others' reactions. As adults, they continue using control to guard against their childhood fears. Their dominance is not a sign of strength, but a sign of profound insecurity. It is a defensive posture, built around avoiding the vulnerability they never learned to tolerate. In intimate relationships, the need for control becomes especially powerful. Narcissists often struggle with closeness because intimacy requires authenticity, emotional reciprocity, and vulnerability, all things that threaten their defenses. Instead of embracing mutuality, they try to manage the relationship in a way that keeps them above emotional risk. They may dictate decisions, monitor communication, or demand constant reassurance. They may control through financial means, social isolation, or emotional manipulation. Their partner becomes less of an equal and more of a resource that must be regulated to maintain the narcissist's emotional stability. Because the narcissist fears dependency on others, they create dynamics where others depend on them. This allows them to feel secure, without exposing their own vulnerabilities. Understanding this need for control also helps explain why narcissists struggle with boundaries. Boundaries represent limits the narcissist cannot override, and limits feel like threats. Boundaries imply that the other person has autonomy, feelings and needs that may differ from the narcissist's desires. When someone sets a firm boundary, the narcissist may interpret it as an act of rebellion or disrespect. They may push against the boundary, test it repeatedly, or attempt to undermine it. From their perspective, boundaries weaken their dominance and expose them to potential rejection. Allowing someone else to define the terms of interaction is terrifying, because it means surrendering the power they rely on for emotional survival. Even outside of relationships, narcissists exhibit an intense desire to control their environment, reputation, and narrative. They may carefully curate their public image, investing tremendous energy into appearing successful, admired, or enviable. They may exaggerate achievements, hide failures, or manipulate situations to ensure they remain at the center of attention. Their need to dominate perceptions is rooted in the belief that their inflated identity must be maintained at all costs. If the world sees them as anything less than exceptional, the gap between their mask and their inner self becomes too painful to bear. Yet, despite this relentless need for control, narcissists often remain unaware of how destructive their behavior is to others. They interpret their actions as natural responses to threats, or as justified attempts to maintain order. Many lack the introspective capacity to see when they are hurting someone or crossing boundaries. They may view themselves as victims of disobedience or betrayal, rather than recognizing their own role in creating conflict. This lack of awareness allows the cycle of dominance to continue unchecked, often leaving a trail of emotional damage in their wake. For those who interact closely with narcissists, understanding this dynamic is essential. Recognizing that control is their emotional lifeline, not simply a desire for superiority, can help clarify confusing behaviors. It can also help individuals resist internalizing the blame that narcissists often project. While empathy for their struggles may arise, it must be tempered with firm boundaries and self-protection. A narcissist's need for control does not give them the right to dominate another person's emotional world. For narcissists who seek healing, confronting their relationship with control becomes one of the most challenging steps. They must learn to tolerate the discomfort of vulnerability, to relinquish the illusion that dominance equals safety, and to build an identity not based on superiority but on authenticity. This process requires patience, self-reflection, and often professional support. It involves questioning the narratives they have created about themselves and others, acknowledging the impact of their behavior, and developing new ways to regulate their emotions. Healing does not mean relinquishing all control, it means learning to live without using control as a shield against fear. Ultimately, the narcissist's need for dominance is rooted in deep emotional survival strategies. Control is their armor, their safety net, and their way of preventing the world from touching the wounds they carry. But as long as their life is built around maintaining control, true intimacy, peace, and self-acceptance remain out of reach. The journey toward healing begins when they recognize that control is not strength but fear disguised as power. And for those who love or have loved a narcissist, understanding this truth can be the first step toward reclaiming their own sense of freedom and emotional clarity. Chapter 6: Love, Attachment, and the Desire to Possess. To understand the narcissist, one must explore how they experience love, not just how they perform it outwardly. Narcissistic individuals often develop what can be described as a distorted attachment style, rooted in early relational deficits and emotional neglect. Their formative experiences with caregivers, whether inconsistent, conditional, overindulgent, or dismissive, shape a blueprint for how they approach intimacy and affection as adults. Love for a narcissist is both desired and feared. It is a source of longing, yet it is fraught with the danger of exposure, vulnerability, and perceived inadequacy. Their relationships often oscillate between intense attachment and sudden withdrawal, reflecting an internal struggle between craving connection and defending the fragile self. At the core of this struggle is a distorted attachment style. Attachment theory suggests that secure attachment develops when a child's needs for safety, comfort, and attunement are consistently met. Secure attachment fosters the capacity to regulate emotions, trust others, and develop a stable sense of self-worth. Narcissists, by contrast, often emerge from environments that fail to provide consistent emotional security. They may have experienced caregivers who were unpredictably loving, overly critical, emotionally unavailable, or overly controlling. As a result, the narcissist learns to link love with performance approval or submission to the caregiver's needs. They may also learn that showing vulnerability or expressing neediness risks rejection or shame. These early experiences instill a deep fear of emotional exposure and a persistent drive to control relational dynamics, shaping their adult attachment behaviors. This distorted attachment style often manifests in the classic pattern known as the idealization, devaluation, discard cycle. The cycle begins with idealization, a phase in which the narcissist elevates a partner to a pedestal, showering them with attention, charm, and apparent devotion. This behavior is often intoxicating to their partner, who may feel uniquely valued and deeply desired. But the idealization is not a reflection of authentic emotional intimacy. It is a projection of the narcissist's fantasy of perfection. They are not connecting with the partner as a separate individual, but rather with the partner as a reflection of their own needs, desires, and imagined ideals. This phase serves a dual purpose. It ensures the partner's attachment and admiration while momentarily soothing the narcissist's internal void through projected perfection. However, idealization is inherently unsustainable because the narcissist's capacity for authentic emotional attunement is limited. Over time, discrepancies between their expectations and reality, perceived slights or challenges to their control trigger devaluation. The partner, once adored, is suddenly criticized, dismissed, or emotionally devalued. This shift can be subtle at first, a missed compliment, a small rebuke, but it often escalates to overt contempt or withdrawal. The narcissist may exaggerate faults, magnify mistakes, or rewrite events to reinforce the partner's perceived inadequacy. Devaluation protects the narcissist by creating emotional distance, shielding them from the vulnerability inherent in authentic love. It also allows them to maintain the illusion of superiority. By diminishing the partner, they elevate themselves in comparison. Finally, in many cases, the cycle culminates in discard. The partner may be abruptly abandoned, replaced, or pushed to leave, due to relentless criticism, neglect, or emotional manipulation. This discard is not always final. Narcissists often return later, repeating the cycle with renewed charm and idealization. The pattern reinforces the narcissist's relational strategy. They oscillate between drawing others close and repelling them, maintaining power and emotional regulation, while avoiding the vulnerability of genuine intimacy. For the partner, this cycle creates confusion, emotional exhaustion, and a sense of being trapped in a relationship they cannot fully predict or control. Understanding how narcissists experience love requires recognizing the distinction between their inner reality and their outward expression. Internally, narcissists often feel longing and desire, but these emotions are intertwined with fear and insecurity. Love can trigger vulnerability, shame, and the possibility of exposure. The deeper the connection, the more the narcissist risks confronting the inadequacy and emptiness they spend a lifetime defending against. As a result, they may unconsciously regulate love to minimize risk. They crave attachment yet simultaneously fear its demands. This tension explains why narcissists may appear intensely passionate one moment and emotionally distant the next. Externally, Narcissists express love through control, performance, and projection rather than empathy and attunement. Their displays of affection, gifts, or attention are often transactional, aimed at eliciting admiration, securing loyalty, or reinforcing their own self-image. They may equate love with obedience, admiration, or the reinforcement of their superiority. Genuine attunement to a partner's emotional needs, especially needs that challenge the narcissist or expose their vulnerability, is often limited or absent. The narcissist may be highly skilled at mimicry, adopting behaviors they believe will meet relational expectations, but this does not equate to authentic empathy. The love they express is filtered through the lens of self-preservation, and the partner's autonomy or individuality can become secondary to the narcissist's desire to feel safe, admired, or powerful. Possession is central to the narcissist's approach to love. They often equate attachment with ownership, believing that affection is only valuable if it reinforces their control or validates their importance. This possessiveness is not solely about jealousy. It reflects the narcissist's internal fear of abandonment and rejection. Losing a partner is perceived as losing the validation, control, and emotional stability that the partner provides. The desire to possess is a defense against the unpredictability of relational life, ensuring that the narcissist can manage their environment and reduce exposure to emotional discomfort. The possessive nature of narcissistic love can have profound effects on relationships. Partners may feel confined, manipulated, or constantly monitored. Narcissists may employ tactics such as guilt, subtle threats, comparison with others, or emotional withdrawal to reinforce dependence. Triangulation can also be used to maintain relational dominance, as introducing third-party comparisons can heighten the partner's insecurity and ensure loyalty. Partners may find themselves performing to meet the narcissist's expectations, mirroring the same patterns of conditional acceptance the narcissist experienced in childhood. This repetition perpetuates the cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard, creating a relational pattern that mirrors the narcissist's own formative experiences. Another consequence of narcissists' distorted attachment is their difficulty with reciprocity. While they may expect intense attention, admiration, and emotional labor from their partners, they often struggle to provide the same in return. Emotional attunement requires tolerating vulnerability, empathizing without self-protection, and regulating emotions in ways that narcissists were rarely taught as children. Instead, they may prioritize their own needs, respond defensively to feedback, and avoid situations that require sustained emotional investment. The imbalance in attachment creates relational tension, leaving partners feeling unseen, unheard, or emotionally depleted. Despite these challenges, narcissists are capable of moments of genuine connection, particularly when their fear of exposure is low or when the partner aligns with their internalized ideals. However, these moments are fragile and often short-lived, because the narcissist's emotional architecture is not designed to sustain unfiltered intimacy. True vulnerability threatens the delicate equilibrium of the false self, and the closer a partner comes to understanding the inner self, the greater the risk perceived by the narcissist. Love, therefore, becomes a dance of closeness and distance, engagement and withdrawal, a cycle designed to maintain the narcissist's safety while giving the illusion of connection. The consequences of this relational pattern are not limited to partners. Children, family members, and close friends may experience similar dynamics. The narcissist may demand loyalty, attention, or validation from anyone within their emotional sphere. Attachment is structured around hierarchy, control, and self-protection. Those who resist or assert independence may face criticism, withdrawal, or devaluation. Those who comply may reinforce the narcissist's sense of stability, while simultaneously perpetuating cycles of conditional acceptance. The ripple effects of distorted attachment extend far beyond romantic relationships, shaping how the narcissist navigates the social world. Healing or change in these relational patterns requires an extraordinary level of self-awareness and willingness to confront deeply buried vulnerabilities. Narcissists must learn to tolerate discomfort, process shame, and cultivate empathy for the autonomous experiences of others. They must shift from attachment as possession to attachment as mutuality, recognizing that love does not require dominance, control, or constant validation. This journey is challenging because it necessitates dismantling patterns that were protective in childhood but dysfunctional in adulthood. It also involves acknowledging the inner emptiness and fear that the mask was designed to conceal. From the perspective of the partner or loved one, understanding the narcissist's attachment style is critical. Recognizing that idealization, devaluation, and discard are not purely intentional acts of cruelty, but rather projections of fear, shame, and unmet needs, can offer clarity and boundaries. While empathy for the narcissist may arise, it must be balanced with self-preservation. A partner cannot fulfill the narcissist's emotional void without losing themselves in the process. Setting boundaries, maintaining autonomy, and seeking relational patterns that honor mutual respect are essential to prevent the cycle from perpetuating harm. Ultimately, narcissists' experience of love is a paradox. They crave intimacy, affection, and validation, yet they fear the vulnerability that authentic love demands. They desire closeness while maintaining distance, idealizing partners only to devalue them, and seeking connection while simultaneously managing it as a mechanism of control. Love for them is both a source of longing and a domain of peril. The patterns they develop are adaptive responses to early emotional injuries, but become maladaptive when applied to adult relationships. Understanding this paradox is essential to comprehending narcissistic behavior, anticipating relational dynamics, and fostering pathways toward awareness and change. The desire to possess, the oscillation between idealization and devaluation, and the fear of emotional exposure form the core of narcissistic attachment. It is not that narcissists are incapable of love, but rather that their developmental history has shaped a relational architecture in which love must be managed, controlled, and defended against. The mask they wear, the patterns they follow, and the cycles they perpetuate all serve the singular purpose of navigating intimacy without collapsing under the weight of vulnerability. For the narcissist, love is inseparable from fear, and attachment is inseparable from the drive to protect the fragile self. Only through insight, courage, and emotional growth can these patterns be transformed, allowing the narcissist and those who love them to experience a form of connection that is authentic, balanced, and enduring. The journey into the narcissist's experience of love reveals the profound tension between desire and defense. It shows how early relational wounds echo throughout a lifetime, shaping behaviors that simultaneously seek and repel intimacy. By understanding the distorted attachment style, the idealization, devaluation, discard cycle, and the difference between internal experience and external expression, we gain a clearer picture of the emotional landscape of the narcissist. This insight is not intended to excuse harmful behavior, but to illuminate its origins and mechanisms, offering a foundation for both compassion and strategic engagement. It prepares us to explore the next chapters, where the consequences of these relational patterns and the possibilities for change and healing will be examined in depth. Chapter 7: The Relationship Illusion: Why They Attract and Harm Empaths. The relationships narcissists form are rarely simple, and the connection between a narcissist and an empath is one of the most intricate and revealing examples of relational dynamics. On the surface, these pairings can seem magnetic and almost fated, drawing together two seemingly complementary personalities. Yet beneath the attraction lies a complex interplay of psychological needs, survival strategies, and emotional vulnerabilities that often results in a cycle of attachment, manipulation, and emotional depletion. To understand why narcissists attract empaths, how these dynamics function, and why they can become harmful, it is necessary to examine the inner motivations and unconscious patterns of both parties. Empaths are individuals with heightened sensitivity to the emotions, needs, and suffering of others. They are naturally attuned to the feelings of people around them, often absorbing emotional states and responding with care, understanding, and compassion. Narcissists, with their emotional fragmentation and difficulty accessing genuine empathy, unconsciously recognize empaths as sources of validation, attention, and attunement that they themselves cannot provide. Empaths, in turn, often sense a wounded core beneath the narcissist's mask, a vulnerability that appeals to their innate desire to heal and protect. This sets the stage for a dynamic in which both parties unconsciously fulfill roles aligned with their psychological wiring. The narcissist receives care and affirmation, while the empath finds purpose and meaning in giving. The initial attraction is frequently intense and almost instantaneous. Narcissists can be magnetic, projecting charm, confidence, and charisma that draws empaths toward them. In the early stages, they often idealize the empath, recognizing the unique qualities that make the empath responsive, nurturing, and attentive. Empaths, on the other hand, perceive a depth of emotion beneath the narcissist's mask, a sense of mystery or hidden pain that calls to their desire to connect, understand, and heal. At this stage, the relationship can feel exhilarating, intense, and almost predestined, creating a strong emotional bond before either party fully recognizes the complexities of their interplay. This bond, however, is fragile, built not on mutual emotional equilibrium, but on complementary dysfunction. Narcissists seek emotional regulation through the empath's responsiveness. Because they cannot sustain authentic emotional intimacy, they rely on external sources to fill their internal void. Empaths, by contrast, are drawn to the narcissist's apparent vulnerability and the opportunity to provide care, often neglecting their own boundaries in the process. This dynamic creates an imbalanced form of psychological compatibility. The narcissist gains attention and validation, while the empath gains purpose, meaning, and emotional engagement. Both parties are fulfilling unconscious needs, but neither is positioned for truly reciprocal intimacy. A central component of the empath-narcissist dynamic is the creation of trauma bonds. Trauma bonds form when emotional highs and lows are intertwined with attachment, creating intense and addictive relational patterns. In a narcissist-empath relationship, these highs may come in the form of idealization, charm, and affection, while the lows emerge through devaluation, criticism, or emotional withdrawal. The empath becomes emotionally invested, seeking to repair or restore the relationship after each cycle of harm. The intermittent reinforcement, the alternation between connection and disconnection, heightens attachment and creates a form of emotional addiction. Empaths may feel compelled to stay, believing that their care or persistence will eventually lead to the authentic connection they long for. Meanwhile, narcissists gain consistent validation and control over the empath's emotional energy, reinforcing the cycle of dependency. Gaslighting often intensifies this dynamic. Narcissists subtly manipulate reality to maintain dominance and control. They may deny events, shift blame, or reinterpret interactions to ensure the empath questions their perceptions. The empath, attuned to the narcissist's emotions and prone to self-reflection, often internalizes this distortion, doubting their memory, judgment, or intuition. This disorientation further strengthens the trauma bond, as the empath seeks clarity, reassurance, and emotional attunement from the very person who undermines their confidence. The relationship becomes a continuous push and pull, leaving the empath emotionally exhausted, yet unable to disengage due to the deep-seated need for connection and understanding. The empath-narcissist dynamic is further complicated by the narcissist's oscillation between idealization and devaluation. In periods of idealization, the narcissist projects warmth, admiration, and apparent vulnerability, drawing the empath deeper into emotional investment. The empath, sensing potential for healing or intimacy, may respond with heightened care, nurturing, and empathy. In periods of devaluation, the narcissist withdraws, criticizes, or manipulates, triggering feelings of rejection, inadequacy, or anxiety in the empath. These cycles mirror the narcissist's internal oscillation between the false self and the fragile inner self, with the empath inadvertently becoming both the audience and the emotional buffer. The empath's responsiveness and capacity for care make them particularly susceptible to this dynamic, often leading them to tolerate patterns that would be intolerable in other relational contexts. Possessiveness and control also play a significant role. Narcissists, fearing abandonment and the destabilization of their carefully curated self-image, may attempt to regulate the empath's behavior, decisions, or emotional responses. They may frame their control as concern, guidance, or love, creating a relational environment in which the empath feels responsible for the narcissist's emotional stability. The empath's tendency to prioritize others' needs over their own reinforces this dynamic. They may ignore red flags, excuse harmful behavior, or adapt themselves to maintain the relationship, believing that their care is both necessary and morally significant. The narcissist, in turn, interprets this compliance as evidence of loyalty and love, further entrenching the imbalance. Intertwined with these dynamics is the concept of emotional addiction. For empaths, the intense emotional highs and lows of the relationship mimic the neurochemical patterns of addiction. Dopamine spikes accompany moments of connection, affection, and validation from the narcissist, while cortisol and adrenaline surge during periods of devaluation, criticism, or threat. This neurochemical interplay creates a powerful motivational loop. The empath seeks to regain emotional equilibrium and restore connection, while the narcissist continues to alternate between engagement and withdrawal to maintain dominance and emotional fuel. The relationship becomes a cycle of pursuit and retreat, craving and defense, attachment and injury. Both parties are locked in patterns that feel compelling, unavoidable, and at times exhilarating, yet ultimately destabilizing. While the empath-narcissist dynamic is often portrayed as inherently harmful, it is not purely pathological. It is a reflection of deep human needs and survival strategies. Narcissists are drawn to empaths because they provide emotional attunement, validation, and a buffer against vulnerability. Empaths are drawn to narcissists because they perceive potential for healing, intimacy, and meaningful connection. The difficulty arises when the relational pattern becomes dominated by imbalance, manipulation, and trauma bonding. Without awareness, both parties are likely to repeat these patterns, perpetuating cycles of emotional harm and dependency. For empaths, understanding the dynamics of attraction and harm is critical for self-preservation. Awareness of how their empathy can be exploited, how trauma bonds are formed, and how the narcissist's oscillation between idealization and devaluation functions is essential to establishing boundaries. Empaths must learn to differentiate between genuine vulnerability and performed vulnerability, between authentic intimacy and relational manipulation. They must recognize that their care, while valuable, does not obligate them to tolerate harm or sacrifice their emotional well-being. For narcissists, understanding these dynamics can be equally transformative. Recognition of their reliance on empaths for emotional regulation, validation, and control is the first step toward breaking unhealthy patterns. Healing requires developing authentic emotional capacity, learning to regulate emotions internally rather than externally, and cultivating reciprocal intimacy. Without this awareness, narcissists are likely to continue seeking empaths as emotional scaffolds, perpetuating cycles of attachment and harm that reinforce their own inner fragility. At its core, the empath-narcissist relationship illuminates the complex interplay between need and fear, attraction and harm, intimacy and control. It reveals how two individuals, each carrying distinct vulnerabilities, can collide in ways that feel inevitable yet destabilizing. The narcissist's need for emotional regulation and the empath's capacity for care create a compelling magnetism, but this magnetism is built on patterns that are difficult to sustain without awareness, boundaries, and emotional growth. Understanding this dynamic also reframes the concept of blame. The harm experienced by empaths is not necessarily a result of malicious intent, nor is the narcissist's behavior purely calculated. Instead, it is the natural outcome of deeply ingrained patterns developed to cope with vulnerability and unmet emotional needs. Recognition of these patterns does not excuse harm, but it offers insight into the psychological mechanisms at play, providing both empaths and narcissists with the potential for awareness, intervention, and ultimately change. In conclusion, the relationship illusion between narcissists and empaths is a complex and compelling interplay of attraction, psychological needs, and relational dynamics. Narcissists are drawn to empaths for the emotional attunement and validation they cannot generate internally, while empaths are drawn to narcissists for the perceived depth, vulnerability, and potential for intimacy. Trauma bonds, cycles of idealization and devaluation, and emotional addiction create a pattern that is simultaneously magnetic and destructive. Understanding these dynamics provides clarity for both parties. It highlights the unconscious drivers of attraction, reveals the mechanisms of harm, and underscores the importance of boundaries, awareness, and emotional regulation. While the empath-narcissist dynamic is often destabilizing, insight into its underlying patterns offers the possibility of conscious choice, healing, and relational transformation for both the empath seeking self-preservation and the narcissist seeking growth. The allure and the danger of this dynamic lie not in the individuals themselves, but in the intersection of needs and vulnerabilities, the mirroring of inner wounds, and the unconscious repetition of patterns established long before adulthood. For empaths, the lesson is to recognize when compassion becomes self-sacrifice. For narcissists, the lesson is to recognize when seeking validation externally prevents genuine connection. The relationship in its most distilled form is a mirror. It reflects not only the desires and fears of each party, but also the ways in which human beings can become enmeshed in patterns that both attract and harm, simultaneously promising love while perpetuating cycles of emotional dependency. Chapter 8: The Hidden Shame, the Emotion Narcissists Never Show. Beneath the glossy veneer of confidence, charm, and superiority that narcissists present to the world, lies an emotion so deeply buried that most people never glimpse it: shame. Unlike anger, rage, or entitlement, which are often visible and measurable through behavior, shame is subtle, insidious, and profoundly destabilizing. It is the invisible thread that weaves through every aspect of a narcissist's inner life, shaping thoughts, emotions, and interactions in ways that are rarely acknowledged, even by the narcissist themselves. Understanding shame is essential to understanding the narcissistic personality, for it is the hidden engine that drives their defensive behaviors, their need for control, their cycles of idealization and devaluation, and their struggles with intimacy and authenticity. Shame in narcissists is not a fleeting discomfort. It is a pervasive, existential feeling of being fundamentally flawed, unworthy, or inadequate. Unlike guilt, which arises from specific actions or decisions, shame is internalized and global, coloring the narcissist's perception of themselves from the inside out. The origins of this shame often trace back to childhood experiences. Many narcissists grew up in environments where emotional needs were inconsistently met, dismissed, or punished. They may have been criticized for expressing vulnerability, ignored when seeking comfort, or compared unfavorably to siblings or peers. Even in seemingly benign situations, these experiences communicate to a child that their true self is unacceptable. Over time, the child internalizes this message, learning that being seen authentically is dangerous, and that self-worth is conditional, dependent on approval, performance, or compliance. This early shame becomes a psychological wound that the narcissist spends a lifetime attempting to manage. The inflated persona, the mask of confidence and perfection, is constructed as a defense against this shame. Every display of superiority, every assertion of entitlement, and every act of image management serves to shield the fragile self from exposure. Outwardly, narcissists may appear self-assured, impervious to criticism, and even intimidating in their confidence. Inwardly, however, the fear of exposure is constant and acute. The false self is not merely a social facade, it is a psychological necessity, a way of surviving in a world that feels threatening to the vulnerable inner self. The fragility beneath the persona is paradoxical. Narcissists often behave as though they are invulnerable, yet this behavior is a direct response to an intense, unspoken vulnerability. The moment someone challenges their image, criticizes them, or refuses to comply with their needs, the narcissist experiences a sudden destabilization. What appears as rage, withdrawal, or manipulation is often a defensive reaction to the unbearable feeling of shame threatening to surface. They react with intensity not because they are inherently cruel, but because the threat of being seen as flawed or inadequate feels existential. The persona they have spent years cultivating cannot tolerate cracks, and any perceived threat to its integrity triggers a fierce protective response. Shame also explains why narcissists are often so preoccupied with image, status, and validation. External validation serves as a temporary buffer against the internal reality that they fear, the belief that they are fundamentally flawed. Achievements, admiration, or control over others are attempts to prove, both to themselves and to the world, that they are worthy. But this validation is fleeting, and the underlying shame never disappears. Success and admiration may temporarily soothe the internal wound, but the narcissist is acutely aware, consciously or unconsciously, that their worth is conditional. This creates a cycle of perpetual striving and dependence on external approval, fueling behaviors such as perfectionism, competitiveness, and relentless image management. Empathy, which is the capacity to understand and resonate with the feelings of others, is deeply complicated by this hidden shame. Narcissists are not inherently incapable of empathy, but accessing it requires a level of vulnerability that threatens the fragile inner self. When a narcissist tunes into another person's suffering, they may experience echoes of their own shame, which can be overwhelming. Responding authentically with compassion could expose their own perceived inadequacies, leaving them feeling exposed and unprotected. As a result, empathy is often selectively applied, filtered through self-interest, or displayed performatively. They may respond to others' emotions in ways that appear caring on the surface, but are ultimately designed to maintain control, reinforce their image, or secure validation. The inner tension between the desire to connect and the fear of exposure is a defining characteristic of narcissistic relational patterns. Shame makes intimacy profoundly challenging because forming deep, authentic connections requires revealing vulnerability. The narcissist fears that if others see the self beneath the mask, they will confirm the internalized belief of inadequacy. This fear explains the oscillation between idealization and devaluation in relationships. Partners may initially be seen as saviors, capable of affirming the narcissist's worth and soothing shame, but when they inevitably fail to maintain the illusion of perfection, the narcissist reacts with devaluation. The cycle of attraction and rejection is thus a defensive strategy, designed to manage shame while maintaining the semblance of control. Shame also fuels the narcissist's aggression and defensiveness. When someone challenges their image, criticizes them, or refuses to comply with their expectations, the narcissist may respond with rage, projection, or emotional manipulation. These responses are not random or purely reactive. They are attempts to deflect attention from the vulnerable inner self and to protect against the psychological pain of exposure. Criticism, no matter how mild or constructive, can feel like an existential threat, triggering intense emotional reactions. The narcissist may distort reality, attack others, or retreat into withdrawal to preserve the integrity of the persona. This explains why narcissists often appear hypersensitive, defensive, and relentless in their pursuit of control and validation. The hidden nature of shame means that narcissists often struggle with self-awareness. Many do not consciously recognize the depth of their vulnerability or the ways in which it shapes their behavior. They may attribute their defensiveness, aggression, or need for control to external circumstances or the flaws of others rather than to their own inner wounds. This lack of insight makes personal growth and relational repair particularly challenging. To confront their behavior without addressing the underlying shame is often impossible, because the emotional core driving the behavior remains protected. Despite these challenges, empathy and authentic connection are not entirely impossible for narcissists. When they feel safe enough to confront shame, they can access the very vulnerability they have spent a lifetime concealing. This requires a supportive environment, therapeutic intervention, and a willingness to tolerate discomfort without resorting to defense. In therapy, narcissists can begin to recognize the internalized messages of inadequacy, understand the origins of their shame, and learn strategies to tolerate vulnerability without collapsing into rage, withdrawal, or manipulation. Over time, this process can foster the development of genuine empathy, healthier relationships, and a more integrated sense of self. Shame also has a profound effect on the narcissist's worldview. Because they experience themselves as fundamentally flawed, they often perceive the world as threatening, judgmental, or competitive. Their interactions are filtered through the lens of self-protection, leading to behaviors that prioritize control, status, and image over authentic connection. Trust becomes difficult, as vulnerability is equated with danger. They may interpret neutral or even supportive behaviors as criticism or threat, reinforcing defensive patterns. This worldview is both a product of internalized shame and a mechanism for perpetuating the false self. The fragility beneath the persona is not a weakness in the conventional sense, but a reflection of the narcissist's survival strategy. The mask of confidence, entitlement, and grandiosity is not simply performative, it is necessary for functioning in a world that their inner self perceives as dangerous. Every interaction, decision, and performance is shaped by the need to maintain this facade. Yet this facade comes at a cost. It limits genuine emotional experience, creates barriers to intimacy, and perpetuates cycles of validation seeking and defensiveness. The narcissist is simultaneously protected and imprisoned by their own strategies. Shame also explains the intensity of the narcissist's relational patterns. Idealization, devaluation, control, and manipulation are not merely selfish behaviors, they are adaptive strategies designed to manage internal distress. By controlling others, the narcissist can create a sense of safety, temporarily mitigate shame, and regulate the anxiety that arises from potential exposure. By projecting fault onto others, they can preserve the illusion of adequacy. By maintaining the mask, they can avoid confronting the emotional truths that are too threatening to face directly. Without understanding shame, these behaviors may appear inexplicable, callous, or pathological. With understanding, they become comprehensible as defensive strategies rooted in vulnerability. Healing for narcissists begins with the recognition and acceptance of shame. This process requires courage, because acknowledging shame threatens the very foundations of the persona. It demands that the narcissist tolerate feelings of inadequacy, vulnerability, and imperfection, without immediately resorting to defense. Over time, this confrontation with shame can allow for the development of authentic self-esteem, emotional regulation, and relational depth. It is a gradual process, one that often requires external support, reflective work, and sustained effort to counter decades of learned protective behavior. For those who interact closely with narcissists, understanding the role of hidden shame provides critical insight. Recognizing that behaviors such as rage, defensiveness, or control are often defenses against shame, not merely expressions of malice, can foster empathy and inform strategies for setting boundaries, communicating effectively, and protecting oneself emotionally. It allows partners, colleagues, and family members to see beyond the mask and understand the inner struggles that drive narcissistic behavior. Ultimately, the hidden shame of narcissists illuminates the paradox at the heart of their existence. They present themselves as confident, superior, and self-sufficient, yet internally they are fragile, vulnerable, and profoundly wounded. The false self is a masterpiece of survival, yet it also constrains and isolates. Empathy, intimacy, and authentic emotional experience are difficult but not impossible, contingent on the narcissist's willingness to face the very vulnerabilities they have long avoided. Shame is the unspoken story behind the persona, the silent engine of relational patterns, and the invisible weight that shapes every aspect of the narcissist's inner and outer life. By understanding shame, we gain insight into why narcissists behave the way they do, why their relationships often follow predictable patterns, and why the mask, though protective, is ultimately insufficient for true emotional fulfillment. It is the hidden current beneath the surface, simultaneously explaining their defenses, illuminating their fragility, and pointing toward the possibility of growth, awareness, and connection beyond the limitations of the mask. The narcissist's hidden shame is a paradoxical force. It both drives their outward brilliance and traps them within a cycle of fear, defensiveness, and validation seeking. Beneath the grandiosity, the control, and the manipulation lies the simple human desire to be seen, understood, and accepted. The mask, while necessary for survival, obscures the fact that their inner self, though fragile and wounded, is capable of empathy, care, and connection, if they can find the courage to confront the shame they have long hidden. It is this hidden emotion, more than any outward behavior, that defines the narcissist's internal landscape and shapes the patterns of their life, offering both the key to understanding and the path toward potential transformation. Chapter 9: The Narcissist in Crisis, When the Mask Falls Off. The narcissist's life is built upon a carefully constructed facade, a mask that projects strength, confidence, competence, and perfection. This mask shields the fragile inner self from exposure, shame, and vulnerability. For much of their lives, the mask functions effectively, allowing them to navigate relationships, careers, and social hierarchies without revealing the emotional instability beneath. Yet no mask is impervious, and there comes a point, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, when circumstances conspire to fracture the illusion. Crisis is an inevitable test of the narcissist's defenses, a moment when the gap between the false self and the vulnerable inner self becomes impossible to ignore. It is a profound, disorienting experience, one that can catalyze rage, retreat, or reinvention, and it is in these moments that the psychological reality of the narcissist is most visible. Crises for narcissists can take many forms. Midlife collapse is a common precipitant, often triggered by unmet expectations, declining physical vitality, or the realization that achievements have not produced the satisfaction they anticipated. The external markers of success, a career, social standing, wealth, or appearance, fail to sustain the self-esteem the mask has promised. Public failure, such as professional setbacks, legal troubles, or social embarrassment, can likewise shatter the image they have carefully curated. Exposure is particularly threatening, whether it comes in the form of relational betrayals, revelations of deception, or public scrutiny that reveals the disparity between perception and reality. In all these situations, the narcissist confronts the terrifying prospect that the persona they have relied upon for protection may no longer suffice. When the mask begins to crack, the narcissist's reaction is often immediate and intense. Rage is a common first response. This rage is not primarily directed at the source of the crisis, but is instead a defensive reaction to the internal threat of shame and exposure. In the narcissist's perception, any challenge to their image is an existential threat, a confirmation of the inadequacy they have long denied. The intensity of the response is proportional to the fragility of the underlying self. Those with more entrenched, false selves and deeper hidden shame may react with explosive anger, verbal attacks, or aggressive efforts to reassert control. The goal is to externalize the internal chaos, to protect the fragile identity from the recognition of its vulnerability. Retreat is another common response. In some cases, narcissists withdraw emotionally, socially, or physically when their mask is compromised. Retreat allows them to avoid immediate confrontation, minimize public scrutiny, and regain a sense of safety while strategizing their next move. This withdrawal can manifest as a literal disappearance from social or professional spaces, the termination of relationships, or a psychological retreat into fantasy, denial, or self-delusion. Retreat serves as a containment strategy. By temporarily isolating themselves, narcissists can manage the overwhelming anxiety, shame, and fear that arise when the persona is threatened. This retreat is rarely a permanent escape. It is often a prelude to reinvention, a period of regrouping before the mask is reconstructed or replaced. Reinvention is perhaps the most adaptive, but still fundamentally defensive response to crisis. Narcissists are skilled at reconstructing their persona to align with shifting circumstances, public perception, or internal needs. Reinvention may involve creating a new image of success, pursuing new relationships that reinforce self-esteem, adopting a new lifestyle, or repositioning themselves professionally or socially. The goal is always to restore the equilibrium between external perception and internal vulnerability. The process of reinvention is both strategic and performative. It allows the narcissist to maintain the illusion of competence, desirability, and superiority, while suppressing the fear, shame, and inadequacy that threaten to surface. Rebuilding the mask during crisis is a meticulous and psychologically intense endeavor. Narcissists often scrutinize the components of their image, identifying weaknesses, inconsistencies, or exposures that must be repaired or replaced. This reconstruction may involve exaggerating successes, curating public appearances, or manipulating narratives to regain admiration and validation. Relationships are frequently recalibrated. Individuals who were witnesses to the collapse may be devalued or discarded, while new allies, supporters, or admirers are recruited to reinforce the reconstructed identity. Social media, public statements, and personal branding become tools for managing perception, ensuring that the mask projects stability, strength, and resilience even when the inner self remains fractured. The emotional experience during this crisis is profound. Beneath the fury, withdrawal, or performative reinvention lies an acute awareness of vulnerability. The narcissist may feel unmoored, exposed, and uncertain, confronted with the truth that their self-worth has been externally dependent, and that the persona they relied upon is insufficient for self-validation. This existential disorientation can lead to psychological stress, depression, anxiety, or even physical symptoms. Yet, because the mask is central to survival, the narcissist is rarely able to fully confront the emotional reality. Instead, they double down on defensive strategies, employing aggression, charm, or strategic reinvention to stabilize the outer world while suppressing internal turbulence. The social consequences of a narcissist's crisis are often significant. Colleagues, partners, friends, or family members may witness behaviors that are more erratic, reactive, or transparent than usual. The previously controlled, confident persona may crack, revealing glimpses of insecurity, desperation, or emotional instability. This exposure can create conflict, confusion, or alarm among those close to the narcissist. For individuals who have long been accustomed to the narcissist's projected infallibility, seeing cracks in the mask can be disorienting and destabilizing. It may also provoke confrontation, boundary setting, or distancing, further complicating the narcissist's efforts to regain control and rebuild the persona. Despite the intensity of the crisis, the narcissist's underlying goal remains consistent: to restore equilibrium between perception and reality, to protect the fragile inner self from full exposure, and to reclaim the sense of competence and superiority that validates existence. Every action, from rage to retreat to reinvention, is oriented toward this goal. Even behaviors that appear self-destructive, irrational, or excessive are strategically tied to maintaining the illusion of control and mitigating the internal distress caused by exposure. The mask may be damaged, but the narcissist's imperative to protect and reconstruct it is relentless. Interestingly, crises often serve as catalysts for more extreme or creative forms of persona construction. Some narcissists leverage failure or exposure as an opportunity to reinvent themselves in a way that amplifies admiration or sympathy. A public failure may be reframed as a courageous risk or misunderstood brilliance. A midlife collapse may be presented as a transformative journey, a reinvention that highlights resilience, insight, or vision. These narrative strategies are psychologically sophisticated. They allow the narcissist to regain control of perception while concealing vulnerability. In this way, crises do not necessarily weaken the narcissist's influence or identity. They can become opportunities for consolidating power, manipulating perception, and demonstrating resourcefulness. However, the process of mask reconstruction is not infallible. The narcissist's inner fragility means that each subsequent crisis has the potential to intensify psychological stress and defensive behaviors. Repeated failures or exposures can erode confidence in the mask's efficacy, creating cumulative anxiety and instability. In some cases, the repeated cracking of the facade may provoke existential reflection or confrontation with the self, a moment in which the narcissist is forced to acknowledge the limitations of the persona. These moments are rare and psychologically taxing, requiring the narcissist to balance fear, shame, and the desire for preservation against the potential for genuine insight or change. During crisis, interpersonal strategies often shift dramatically. The narcissist may attempt to manipulate, charm, or intimidate others to regain the sense of control lost when the mask faltered. Allies may be courted, adversaries neutralized, and narratives carefully curated to maintain influence and reputation. Relationships are instrumentalized. They become mechanisms to re-establish the social scaffolding necessary to sustain the reconstructed persona. Partners or colleagues may experience a sudden change in demeanor, alternating between charm and defensiveness, as the narcissist navigates the complex terrain of exposure, shame, and the desire for restoration. One of the most revealing aspects of a narcissist in crisis is the glimpse it provides into the inner self. While the mask is ultimately reconstructed, moments of crisis expose the underlying fragility, fear, and hidden shame that drive the persona. Observers may note inconsistencies, vulnerability, or intense emotional reactions that are otherwise masked in day-to-day interactions. These moments highlight the duality at the heart of narcissism: a public self of projected strength and control, and a private self of fragility, fear, and unmet needs. Understanding this duality is essential to comprehending narcissistic behavior, particularly in moments of stress, failure, or exposure. Crisis also illuminates the limitations of the narcissist's coping mechanisms. While the mask can be highly effective in maintaining external perception, it cannot eliminate internal vulnerability. Exposure, failure, or loss triggers emotions that cannot be entirely suppressed or controlled, forcing the narcissist to confront the very feelings they have long avoided. Rage, retreat, reinvention, and manipulation are all strategies to manage this confrontation, but the emotional intensity cannot be entirely escaped. The crisis thus functions as a psychological stress test, revealing both the strengths and limitations of the defensive system the narcissist has constructed over a lifetime. Healing and transformation during crisis are possible, but they require an extraordinary willingness to confront the self beneath the mask. The narcissist must tolerate vulnerability, shame, and imperfection without immediately resorting to defensive strategies. They must recognize that the persona, while protective, is not a sufficient basis for authentic self-esteem or relational intimacy. Such work is psychologically demanding and often resisted, as it threatens the very structures that have sustained the narcissist's functioning. Nonetheless, crisis presents a unique opportunity. By breaking through the protective layers, the narcissist can confront the fragility beneath the mask, potentially initiating a process of self-reflection, emotional integration, and personal growth. From the perspective of those around the narcissist, crisis provides critical insight into patterns that are otherwise hidden. Partners, colleagues, friends, and family may observe behaviors, vulnerabilities, and emotional responses that reveal the underlying fragility masked by competence and charm. Awareness of these dynamics allows others to navigate interactions more strategically, set boundaries, and understand the psychological forces at play. It also underscores the complexity of narcissistic behavior. What may appear as irrationality, cruelty, or arrogance is often a response to intense internal destabilization, fear, and shame. Ultimately, the narcissist in crisis embodies the tension between facade and fragility, between control and vulnerability. The mask may falter, but the imperative to protect, restore, and reconstruct it remains central. Rage, retreat, and reinvention are not random reactions. They are purposeful strategies to manage exposure, shame, and fear. Crisis illuminates the inner mechanics of narcissism, revealing both the profound fragility beneath the persona and the extraordinary lengths to which the narcissist will go to maintain equilibrium. The collapse of the mask is both a moment of danger and opportunity. For the narcissist, it threatens exposure, shame, and destabilization. For observers, it offers clarity, insight, and a rare glimpse into the mechanisms that drive behavior. The subsequent reconstruction demonstrates the narcissist's resilience, adaptability, and resourcefulness, but also the persistent fragility at the core. The narcissist's life, even in crisis, remains a delicate balance between perception and reality, between the false self and the inner vulnerability it conceals. Understanding this dynamic is essential to understanding narcissism itself, revealing the hidden emotional forces that shape behavior, relationships, and the ongoing effort to maintain the illusion of perfection while navigating the inevitable crises of life. In the end, the narcissist in crisis is a study in paradox, powerful yet fragile, confident yet vulnerable, strategic yet reactive. The mask may fall, exposing the inner turmoil that the world rarely sees, but the drive to rebuild it is relentless, fueled by fear, shame, and the necessity of survival. Recognizing these patterns offers insight, empathy, and perspective, allowing both narcissists and those around them to navigate the turbulent space between facade and self, exposure and reinvention, collapse and recovery. It is in this crucible of crisis that the true nature of narcissism, its defenses, fragility, and potential for transformation is most clearly revealed. Chapter 10: Variations of Narcissism Beyond the Stereotypes. When most people hear the term narcissist, they conjure a single, often exaggerated image, someone overtly grandiose, self-absorbed, and charming yet cruel, perhaps the proverbial social predator or arrogant executive. While this caricature captures certain manifestations of narcissism, it represents only a fraction of the spectrum. Narcissism is not monolithic. It encompasses a range of types, each with distinct behavioral patterns, underlying motivations, and adaptive strategies. Understanding these variations is essential, not only to identify narcissistic tendencies in real-world contexts, but also to comprehend the psychological and developmental roots that give rise to each type. One of the foundational distinctions in the study of narcissism is between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. Grandiose narcissists are the archetypal image that most people recognize. They project an air of superiority, confidence, and entitlement. They seek admiration and attention openly, often boasting about achievements, demonstrating social dominance and asserting control over others. Their outward self-assurance masks a fragile internal core that cannot tolerate exposure or criticism. Grandiose narcissists thrive on visibility and validation, using charisma, achievement, and performance as a shield against shame. They often appear socially confident, highly capable, and assertive, but their relationships are frequently superficial, instrumental, and contingent on maintaining the perception of superiority. Vulnerable narcissists, by contrast, are less conspicuous but equally impactful in their relational environments. Their narcissism manifests internally rather than externally. They may appear shy, self-effacing, or anxious, masking their needs for validation behind insecurity and sensitivity. Vulnerable narcissists are highly attuned to perceived slights, rejection, or criticism, and they may oscillate between withdrawal and passive-aggressive behaviors as a means of protecting their fragile self-esteem. Unlike grandiose narcissists, who seek admiration openly, vulnerable narcissists seek reassurance and validation subtly, often through self-pity, complaints, or expressions of suffering designed to elicit empathy. Their internal experience is dominated by shame, fear of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to evaluation, making their relational strategies reactive, cautious, and emotionally turbulent. Within these broad categories, additional subtypes emerge, each shaped by unique combinations of temperament, early experiences, and relational adaptations. Covert narcissists, sometimes referred to as closet narcissists, are characterized by introversion, hypersensitivity, and an inward focus on perceived inadequacy. They may not seek the spotlight overtly, but they harbor intense feelings of entitlement, envy, and resentment, often comparing themselves to others and feeling slighted when recognition is denied. Covert narcissists may express their narcissism through subtle manipulation, self-victimization, or passive-aggressive behavior, masking grandiosity behind humility or insecurity. Their relational patterns often involve a tension between longing for acknowledgement and fear of exposure, making them appear enigmatic, elusive, or emotionally inconsistent. Communal narcissists represent another distinct manifestation. Unlike traditional grandiose narcissists, whose focus is on personal achievement, power, or status, communal narcissists seek validation through perceived moral superiority or contributions to others. They may appear altruistic, generous, or socially conscious, often emphasizing their helpfulness, selflessness, or ethical standards. Yet their motivation is not pure concern for others, but the reinforcement of their self-image. Communal narcissists derive satisfaction from being admired as morally exceptional, often comparing themselves to others to highlight their own virtue. Their relationships are shaped by a desire to be recognized as indispensable or exceptional in ethical or social terms, creating patterns of conditional generosity, moral judgment, and emotional expectation. Malignant narcissism, widely regarded as the most destructive form, combines elements of narcissism with antisocial traits such as aggression, manipulativeness, and lack of remorse. Malignant narcissists are highly strategic, socially adept, and often ruthlessly exploitative. Their behavior is marked by vindictiveness, deceit, and a willingness to harm others to preserve power, dominance, or self-image. Unlike other narcissistic types, malignant narcissists may derive pleasure from controlling, humiliating, or inflicting pain on others, blurring the line between self-protection and deliberate cruelty. Their inner world is dominated by a combination of fear, rage, and entitlement, creating an externally imposing persona underpinned by extreme vulnerability and emotional instability. Somatic narcissists focus predominantly on their physical presence, health, appearance, or sexual desirability. Their validation comes from the perceived impact they have on others through their bodies, rather than achievements, moral standing, or social influence. They may engage in excessive grooming, fitness regimes, or sexual conquests to reinforce a sense of superiority. Somatic narcissism often coexists with grandiose tendencies, but its central focus is the physical self and the admiration it elicits. The somatic narcissist's relationships are often transactional, driven by the desire for attention, affirmation, or adulation, rather than authentic intimacy or mutual growth. Each type of narcissism forms through distinct developmental pathways, although common threads exist. Early experiences of neglect, inconsistent caregiving, conditional love, or trauma create a sense of vulnerability and unworthiness, which the individual then learns to protect through defensive strategies. The specific form these strategies take depends on temperament, social environment, and coping mechanisms. Grandiose narcissists may respond to early inadequacy with externalized self-aggrandizement, while vulnerable or covert narcissists internalize shame and develop subtle defensive relational tactics. Communal narcissists may focus on moral superiority to secure approval, whereas somatic narcissists seek attention through physical presence. Malignant narcissists often emerge when early trauma combines with temperament, prone to aggression and antisocial tendencies. Behaviorally, each type exhibits distinct patterns. Grandiose narcissists dominate conversations, assert control, and demand admiration. Vulnerable narcissists vacillate between withdrawal and covert manipulation. Communal narcissists highlight moral or social contributions to assert superiority. Somatic narcissists focus on appearance and sexual appeal. Malignant narcissists pursue power and control with a strategic, often ruthless approach. Despite these differences, a common thread runs through all types: the drive to protect a fragile inner self, manage shame, and secure external validation. Understanding these variations is critical for recognizing narcissism in its diverse forms. Stereotypical images of narcissists as overtly grandiose or aggressively self-centered are insufficient. Many forms of narcissism are subtle, hidden, or socially disguised. Covert and vulnerable narcissists in particular can be difficult to detect because their behaviors are internalized, reactive, or framed as insecurity, sensitivity, or self-consciousness. Communal and somatic narcissists may appear virtuous, altruistic, or attractive, masking their underlying need for validation. Malignant narcissists, while more overtly destructive, demonstrate how narcissism can intersect with antisocial tendencies to produce complex and dangerous relational dynamics. These variations also illuminate why relationships with narcissists can be so confusing and emotionally challenging. Each type elicits different responses from others. Grandiose narcissists provoke admiration or resentment. Vulnerable narcissists evoke pity, protectiveness, or frustration. Communal narcissists can inspire moral alignment or moral fatigue. Somatic narcissists often attract superficial attention or desire. Malignant narcissists generate fear, compliance, or conflict. Recognizing the type of narcissism present in a relationship is essential for understanding dynamics, predicting behavior, and establishing boundaries. Despite their differences, all forms of narcissism share an underlying psychological architecture: a fragile inner self, a pervasive sense of shame or inadequacy, and a reliance on external validation to maintain equilibrium. The mask each type constructs is tailored to social, relational, and environmental demands, but its purpose is consistent: to defend against exposure, manage vulnerability, and preserve a sense of worth. Even the most charming, altruistic, or seemingly secure narcissist carries this hidden fragility, and the strategies they employ to maintain the illusion are shaped by the type of narcissism they embody. The interplay of temperament, experience, and social context also explains why narcissistic types can shift or blend. A vulnerable narcissist may develop grandiose tendencies over time in response to environmental reinforcement or social opportunity. A communal narcissist may display covert traits in private relationships. Malignant narcissists may fluctuate between grandiose and somatic strategies depending on context. This fluidity highlights the adaptive nature of narcissistic behavior. The mask is dynamic, evolving to meet challenges, protect the inner self, and secure validation. Understanding the full spectrum of narcissism challenges oversimplified cultural narratives and stereotypes. It requires recognizing that narcissists are not merely arrogant or selfish, but are individuals navigating profound internal fragility through adaptive, albeit often dysfunctional, strategies. Each type of narcissism is a response to early relational environments, emotional trauma, and perceived threats to self-worth. By examining these variations, we gain a deeper appreciation of how narcissism manifests in diverse contexts, how it shapes relational dynamics, and why interventions or boundaries must be tailored to the specific type and underlying vulnerabilities present. Ultimately, The study of narcissistic variations reveals the complexity of human psychology. Narcissism is not a single trait, but a constellation of adaptive strategies, defensive mechanisms, and relational behaviors rooted in early experiences of inadequacy, shame, or emotional injury. Grandiose, vulnerable, covert, communal, malignant, and somatic narcissists each demonstrate distinct patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior, yet all share the central drive to protect a fragile self and secure external validation. Recognizing these variations deepens our understanding of narcissistic behavior, informs how we engage with narcissists in relationships, and underscores the importance of approaching narcissism with nuance, insight, and psychological sophistication. By moving beyond stereotypes and acknowledging the diversity of narcissistic expression, we can better predict relational patterns, anticipate challenges, and develop strategies for communication, boundary setting, and self-preservation. We also gain insight into the underlying human needs, connection, recognition, safety, and self-worth that narcissists attempt to meet, however imperfectly. The variations of narcissism, while often challenging or damaging to others, are ultimately adaptive responses to internal fragility, revealing both the vulnerability and the ingenuity that underlie the persona. In exploring these variations, it becomes clear that narcissism is not merely a problem to be identified and avoided, but a complex psychological phenomenon that requires careful observation, empathetic understanding, and strategic navigation. Each type reflects a unique intersection of temperament, development, and relational strategy, highlighting the intricate ways in which humans cope with shame, inadequacy, and the universal desire to be seen and valued. By appreciating the breadth and depth of narcissistic expression, we gain a more complete understanding of both the individual and relational impact of narcissism, preparing us to navigate interactions with awareness, clarity, and resilience. Chapter 11: Healing the Victims, Reclaiming Identity After Narcissistic Abuse. The aftermath of a relationship with a narcissist is rarely simple. Victims often emerge from such experiences feeling disoriented, emotionally exhausted, and profoundly wounded. Narcissistic abuse, whether overt, subtle, or long-term, leaves traces on identity, self-esteem, and the capacity to trust one's own judgment. Victims may question their memories, doubt their perceptions, and internalize blame for behaviors over which they had little control. The healing process is not merely about moving on, it is about reclaiming a sense of self that has been systematically undermined, restoring personal agency, and learning to navigate relationships with clarity and confidence. Recovery requires understanding the unique dynamics of narcissistic abuse, confronting the emotional aftermath, and adopting intentional strategies to rebuild identity, boundaries, and resilience. One of the central challenges victims face is the trauma bond, the psychological tether that forms between a narcissist and their target. Trauma bonding arises from a cycle of intermittent reinforcement, in which periods of idealization, affection, or attention are followed by devaluation, criticism, or emotional withdrawal. These cycles create an emotional addiction. The highs of connection reinforce attachment, while the lows provoke anxiety, fear, and the compulsion to repair or restore the relationship. Victims often feel trapped, oscillating between hope and despair, unable to reconcile the narcissist's charm with their abusive behaviors. Understanding the mechanism of trauma bonding is crucial for healing, as it explains why leaving a narcissist can feel nearly impossible, and why returning to a harmful relationship can feel instinctive rather than rational. Breaking a trauma bond requires intentionality and self-compassion. The first step is acknowledgement, recognizing the patterns of abuse and understanding that the behaviors experienced were not the victim's fault. Narcissists are skilled manipulators who distort reality, often projecting blame onto their targets, minimizing harm, or exploiting guilt. Victims must disentangle themselves from these distorted narratives, affirming that mistreatment, manipulation, or exploitation is unacceptable and that their needs, feelings, and boundaries are valid. This acknowledgement forms the foundation for rebuilding a sense of agency and self-trust. Emotional processing is another essential component of healing. Victims often carry layers of shame, guilt, fear, and grief. They may mourn not only the loss of the relationship, but also the parts of themselves that were suppressed, invalidated, or compromised. Processing these emotions involves allowing oneself to feel without judgment, often with the support of therapy, journaling, or safe social networks. It is a deliberate confrontation with the pain that the narcissist sought to exploit or dismiss, transforming suppressed trauma into conscious awareness. This step is critical because unprocessed emotions can perpetuate cycles of self-doubt, anxiety, and vulnerability to future manipulation. Rebuilding self-esteem after narcissistic abuse is a gradual but transformative process. Victims are encouraged to reconnect with their intrinsic worth, independent of external validation. The narcissist's consistent devaluation can leave individuals questioning their intelligence, attractiveness, or emotional competence. Engaging in activities that foster accomplishment, creativity, and self-expression helps restore a sense of competence and identity. Celebrating small achievements, pursuing passions, and reinforcing personal strengths are practical strategies to counteract internalized narratives of inadequacy. Over time, these practices create an internal feedback loop in which the individual experiences affirmation from within rather than relying on others for validation. Boundary restoration is another critical element of recovery. Narcissists frequently violate, manipulate, or exploit boundaries, teaching victims that their needs and limits are secondary to the narcissist's desires. Reclaiming personal boundaries requires recognizing what is acceptable in relationships and asserting those limits consistently. This may include saying no without guilt, limiting contact with toxic individuals, or re-evaluating social and professional networks to ensure mutual respect. Boundary setting is both protective and empowering. It allows victims to reclaim control over their emotional and physical space, signaling to themselves and others that their autonomy and well-being are non-negotiable. Education and awareness play an essential role in preventing future entanglement with narcissists. Learning to recognize red flags early, such as excessive charm, inconsistency, lack of empathy, entitlement, or controlling behaviors, equips victims with the ability to identify potential abuse before deep emotional investment occurs. Understanding the psychology of narcissism, including the ways narcissists manipulate perception, exploit empathy, and create dependency, allows survivors to navigate relationships with discernment and confidence. This proactive knowledge transforms vulnerability into informed vigilance, reducing the likelihood of repeating patterns that once caused harm. Support systems are invaluable during the healing journey. Survivors benefit from communities, therapeutic support, or peer networks that validate their experiences and provide safe spaces for emotional processing. Isolation, which narcissists often cultivate, can exacerbate trauma, while connection to understanding individuals fosters resilience and perspective. Sharing experiences with others who have faced similar abuse can normalize emotional responses, reinforce self-worth, and provide practical guidance for boundary setting and self-care. Healing also involves reconstructing identity beyond the relationship with the narcissist. Narcissistic abuse often erodes a person's sense of self, making them question their values, desires, and authenticity. Recovery requires introspection and deliberate self-reclamation, revisiting suppressed goals, exploring personal passions, and reconnecting with authentic desires independent of the narcissist's influence. This process may involve redefining social, professional, or relational priorities, asserting autonomy, and cultivating a life narrative that centers personal empowerment rather than relational subservience. Therapeutic modalities such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, trauma-focused therapy, or somatic experiencing can be particularly effective in addressing the complex effects of narcissistic abuse. CBT helps individuals challenge distorted beliefs about themselves instilled by the narcissist, restructure negative thought patterns, and develop healthier relational frameworks. Trauma-focused therapy provides a safe space to process emotional wounds, develop coping mechanisms, and reduce the intensity of trauma responses. Somatic approaches emphasize reconnecting with the body, recognizing physical manifestations of stress or fear, and integrating emotional and physiological awareness, which is often disrupted in prolonged abusive relationships. Reintegration into social and relational spheres is another significant phase of healing. After extended exposure to manipulation and control, victims may struggle to trust themselves or others. Gradual exposure to safe, respectful interactions allows them to practice autonomy, assertiveness, and discernment in real-world contexts. This phase often involves trial and error, testing boundaries, and developing the confidence to recognize and respond to unhealthy dynamics. As survivors strengthen their relational literacy, they cultivate the ability to form connections rooted in mutual respect, authenticity, and reciprocity, rather than fear, obligation, or emotional coercion. Spiritual or existential reflection can also support recovery. Many survivors report feelings of existential disorientation, questioning their purpose, meaning, or sense of self-worth after narcissistic abuse. Engaging in practices such as mindfulness, meditation, journaling, or philosophical exploration allows survivors to rebuild inner stability, develop self-compassion, and cultivate resilience. Recognizing that their value is inherent, not contingent upon external approval, is a profound step toward emotional freedom and the re-establishment of personal identity. Recovery is rarely linear. Survivors often experience setbacks, triggered memories, or moments of doubt that echo the manipulative patterns of their past. These fluctuations are normal and part of the healing trajectory. Patience, self-compassion, and continued support are essential in navigating these periods. Each instance of self-assertion, boundary maintenance, or emotional clarity represents progress and reinforces the survivor's capacity for autonomy and resilience. An essential aspect of long-term recovery is the integration of learned wisdom into future relational dynamics. Survivors often emerge with heightened emotional intelligence, greater awareness of psychological patterns, and a sharpened capacity to assess character and intentions. This awareness not only reduces vulnerability to future abuse, but also enables more intentional, authentic, and fulfilling connections. The process transforms prior trauma into a source of insight, empowering survivors to engage with the world from a position of clarity rather than fear. Self-care, both physical and emotional, is foundational to reclaiming identity. Prolonged narcissistic abuse often leaves individuals drained, anxious, or disconnected from their bodily and emotional signals. Prioritizing sleep, nutrition, physical activity, mindfulness, and emotionally nurturing activities fosters a renewed sense of vitality and presence. By reconnecting with their bodies and honoring their needs, survivors strengthen their capacity for resilience, self-awareness, and authentic engagement with life. Reclaiming identity also entails redefining the narrative of one's life. Narcissistic abuse often imposes external narratives, framing victims as flawed, inadequate, or responsible for the narcissist's behavior. Healing involves reclaiming the personal narrative, acknowledging resilience, and integrating lessons learned into a self-defined story. This process empowers survivors to honor their growth, recognize their agency, and assert their right to live authentically and independently. Ultimately, healing from narcissistic abuse is a journey of reclaiming autonomy, self-worth, and emotional integrity. It requires recognizing trauma bonds, processing emotional wounds, rebuilding self-esteem, restoring boundaries, and learning to navigate relationships with discernment. The process is deeply personal, often challenging, and yet profoundly transformative. Survivors emerge not only restored, but also equipped with the insight, resilience, and clarity to engage with themselves and the world in ways that prioritize authenticity, safety, and well-being. In conclusion, the path to recovery after narcissistic abuse is both an emotional and existential undertaking. Victims must confront the psychological manipulations, internalized shame, and identity erosion imposed by the narcissist. They must break free from trauma bonds, rebuild confidence, and establish boundaries that protect and affirm their autonomy. Education, therapy, support networks, and deliberate self-reflection facilitate the reclamation of self-worth and agency. Survivors learn to recognize red flags, assert personal needs, and engage in relationships rooted in mutual respect and authenticity. Ultimately, healing is a process of transformation, reclaiming the self that was overshadowed, rediscovering intrinsic value, and constructing a life narrative that honors resilience, agency, and emotional integrity. Through this journey, victims not only recover from the wounds of narcissistic abuse, but also gain the tools, awareness, and empowerment to thrive independently, free from the influence of those who once sought to diminish them. Chapter 12: Healing the Narcissist. Is change actually possible? The question of whether a narcissist can truly change is one of the most complex and debated topics in psychology, therapy, and popular discourse. For many, the image of a narcissist evokes a seemingly immutable character, grandiose, self-centered, and resistant to empathy. This perception is not entirely inaccurate. Narcissistic patterns are deeply ingrained, rooted in early emotional wounds, maladaptive coping strategies, and a protective persona that has been reinforced over decades. Yet, while change is exceedingly difficult, it is not categorically impossible. Understanding the conditions under which transformation may occur, the therapeutic approaches that can facilitate growth, and the difference between authentic accountability and performative remorse is crucial for assessing both the potential and the limits of healing in narcissistic individuals. At the core of the narcissistic personality lies a profound fragility masked by outward displays of confidence, control, and superiority. This inner vulnerability is characterized by shame, fear of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to criticism. The narcissist's behaviors, grandiosity, entitlement, manipulation, and emotional detachment, serve primarily as survival mechanisms designed to protect this fragile inner self. These patterns are not simply habitual, they are psychologically adaptive strategies that have been reinforced across a lifetime, often beginning in childhood environments marked by neglect, conditional love, inconsistency, or trauma. The false self, or mask, is therefore not a superficial facade, but a necessary defense against perceived existential threats. Change, then, requires a radical shift in the narcissist's internal framework, a willingness to confront vulnerability, tolerate shame, and relinquish the protective strategies that have long defined identity and interaction with the world. This is not a superficial or cosmetic adjustment, but a deep psychological transformation. It demands that the narcissist recognize the harm caused to themselves and others, internalize the reality of their limitations, and develop the capacity to experience and express empathy without self-protective distortion. Such a shift is psychologically threatening. It requires dismantling the very defenses that have historically enabled survival, making resistance to change understandable and almost universal. Despite the difficulty, certain conditions make change more plausible. First, self-awareness is critical. Narcissists, who are capable of observing their behavior, acknowledging its consequences, and recognizing the disparity between their persona and inner experience, are more likely to engage in meaningful growth. This self-reflection often arises in response to significant life events, personal crises, relational breakdowns, career failures, or health scares that disrupt the protective efficacy of the mask. In these moments, the narcissist may become acutely aware of the costs of their behaviors, the loss of trust, the disintegration of relationships, or the internal exhaustion caused by constant performance. Awareness alone is insufficient, but it is the necessary first step toward change. Motivation is another essential condition. Narcissists must develop an intrinsic desire to change that is not solely driven by external pressure or coercion. External consequences, such as social ostracization, legal repercussions, or partner ultimata, may provoke superficial compliance or temporary behavioral adjustment, but authentic transformation requires a personal commitment to growth. This motivation is often tied to self-interest, reframed in deeper terms, a desire for genuine relational intimacy, personal fulfillment, or freedom from the exhausting cycle of validation-seeking and defensive behavior. Without this intrinsic motivation, therapy risks producing performative change rather than substantive psychological restructuring. Therapy approaches for narcissistic individuals must balance confrontation with support, challenging entrenched patterns while offering avenues for self-exploration. Traditional talk therapy may be limited if it only targets surface behaviors, as narcissists can employ charm, rationalization, or defensiveness to evade scrutiny. Effective therapeutic modalities often include a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, psychodynamic therapy, and trauma-informed approaches. CBT can help the narcissist recognize distorted thought patterns, challenge automatic assumptions of superiority or entitlement, and develop alternative cognitive frameworks. Psychodynamic therapy explores the origins of narcissistic behaviors in early relational trauma, uncovering unmet needs, internalized shame, and defensive formations that have shaped identity. Trauma-informed approaches acknowledge the vulnerability and emotional wounding underlying narcissism, facilitating the development of safety, self-regulation, and the capacity for emotional processing. Central to therapy is the cultivation of empathy. Narcissists often struggle to perceive and resonate with others' emotions, not due to an absence of capacity, but because engagement with genuine vulnerability threatens the fragile inner self. Therapeutic work involves gradually expanding the narcissist's tolerance for discomfort, shame, and relational exposure, allowing them to experience empathy without immediately retreating into defense. This is a slow, iterative process, requiring repeated experiences of reflection, accountability, and relational attunement. Empathy may initially manifest selectively or performatively, but sustained practice and internalization can lead to genuine emotional attunement over time. Accountability is a crucial marker of potential change. Authentic accountability entails acknowledgement of harm caused, an understanding of one's role in perpetuating abuse or dysfunction, and consistent behavioral modification to prevent recurrence. It is differentiated from fake remorse, which is performative, self-serving, or aimed primarily at preserving external approval. Fake remorse often involves rationalization, deflection, or superficial apologies, without corresponding change in behavior. Genuine accountability, by contrast, is accompanied by self-reflection, emotional engagement, and sustained effort to address the impact of one's actions. It requires the narcissist to relinquish the protective narratives that have historically justified harmful behavior, and to tolerate discomfort without retreating into grandiosity, blame, or manipulation. Rehabilitation also depends on the narcissist's ability to tolerate vulnerability. Many narcissists experience intense fear, anxiety, or shame when confronted with their limitations or exposed to criticism. Therapeutic work that encourages gradual exposure to these emotions, without resorting to defensive strategies, supports the development of emotional resilience and self-regulation. As vulnerability becomes more tolerable, the narcissist can begin to form authentic relational connections, engage in mutual accountability, and pursue personal growth without constant reliance on the external validation that previously sustained their sense of self. Social support can enhance the likelihood of change. A stable, non-judgmental environment that encourages self-reflection and models healthy relational dynamics can reinforce therapeutic gains. Conversely, Relationships that are adversarial, enmeshed, or enablers of narcissistic behavior may perpetuate entrenched patterns and undermine progress. It is therefore critical that therapeutic interventions consider not only the narcissist's internal processes, but also their social ecosystem, including family, work, and relational networks that may influence or reinforce behavior. It is important to acknowledge that even under ideal conditions, change is slow, incremental, and often incomplete. Narcissistic patterns are deeply habituated, reinforced by decades of adaptive survival strategies, and intertwined with the individual's sense of identity. Efforts at transformation require repeated practice, confrontation with discomfort, and sustained reflection. Relapse into old patterns is common, especially under stress, relational conflict, or threats to self-esteem. The goal of therapy, therefore, is not perfection but the gradual development of awareness, accountability, empathy, and emotional flexibility. Even partial change, reducing harmful behaviors, improving relational attunement, and fostering self-reflection, can significantly enhance personal and interpersonal functioning. Another consideration is the type and severity of narcissism. Individuals with overt, grandiose narcissism may respond differently to therapeutic interventions than those with covert, vulnerable, or malignant tendencies. Malignant narcissists, particularly those with co-occurring antisocial traits, present the greatest challenge to transformation due to a combination of aggression, manipulativeness, and lack of remorse. Covert narcissists, while often less overtly destructive, may resist change through withdrawal, denial, or emotional manipulation. Tailoring therapeutic approaches to the individual's personality structure, history, and capacity for introspection increases the likelihood of meaningful progress. The role of self-compassion cannot be underestimated. Narcissists must learn to tolerate imperfection, acknowledge mistakes, and embrace vulnerability without experiencing the existential threat that previously motivated defensive behavior. Developing self-compassion counteracts the chronic internalized shame that underlies narcissistic behavior, reduces reliance on external validation, and fosters authentic self-esteem. Practices such as mindfulness, reflective journaling, and guided therapeutic exercises help cultivate this capacity, creating a foundation for sustainable change. Finally, relational context is both a test and a vehicle for transformation. Healthy, supportive relationships provide opportunities for the narcissist to practice empathy, accountability, and vulnerability in real-world contexts. Partners, friends, or colleagues who establish clear boundaries, maintain consistency, and encourage reflection can serve as mirrors, allowing the narcissist to observe the impact of their behavior and internalize relational feedback. Conversely, relationships that reinforce entitlement, manipulation, or avoidance undermine therapeutic progress, highlighting the importance of carefully managing social interactions during the process of change. In conclusion, healing for narcissistic individuals is rare but not impossible. It requires the convergence of self-awareness, intrinsic motivation, therapeutic intervention, vulnerability tolerance, relational support, and sustained commitment to accountability. Change is often incremental, punctuated by setbacks, and contingent upon the narcissist's willingness to confront the fragility underlying their persona. Therapy approaches that integrate cognitive, psychodynamic, and trauma-informed modalities, while emphasizing empathy, self-compassion, and accountability, offer the most promising path. Differentiating genuine accountability from performative remorse is essential, as the former reflects deep engagement with one's behavior, while the latter perpetuates superficial compliance. While transformation is challenging, understanding the potential for growth reframes narcissism not solely as pathology, but as a dynamic interplay of adaptive strategies and emotional vulnerability. Even partial healing can improve relational functioning, self-regulation, and emotional insight, enhancing the quality of life for both the narcissist and those around them. Ultimately, The possibility of change rests on the narcissist's willingness to dismantle protective facades, engage with internal fragility, and embrace the discomfort inherent in authentic growth, a journey that, while arduous, offers the rare opportunity for genuine transformation. The story of healing narcissists is a story of paradox. It demands both courage and humility, introspection and accountability, vulnerability and self-regulation. Those who embark on this path confront the deepest fears of inadequacy, while striving to cultivate authenticity. It is a path rarely chosen, often resisted, but when pursued with commitment, it demonstrates that even the most entrenched defensive patterns can, under the right conditions, yield to the possibility of awareness, empathy, and meaningful change. The journey is not only about altering behavior, but about reconstructing identity, integrating vulnerability, and finding a sustainable balance between self-protection and authentic relational engagement. In this light, the transformation of a narcissist, while difficult, becomes a testament to the human capacity for psychological adaptation, resilience, and growth. Conclusion: the truth behind the mask. As we reach the conclusion of this journey into the complex world of narcissism, it is essential to pause and reflect on the truths uncovered about the lives, behaviors, and inner landscapes of narcissists. Throughout this book, we have explored the origins, development, and manifestations of narcissistic behavior, moving beyond simplistic stereotypes to a deeper understanding of what drives these individuals, why they act as they do, and how their presence affects those around them. What emerges from this exploration is a paradox. Narcissists, often perceived as cold, arrogant, or self-serving, are also profoundly wounded individuals whose behaviors are protective responses to vulnerability, shame, and unmet emotional needs. They are both architects of harm and victims of hidden pain. Recognizing this duality is not meant to excuse destructive behavior, but to illuminate the intricate psychology behind the mask and offer a framework for awareness, healing, and empowerment. Narcissists are not born as fully formed perpetrators of manipulation or cruelty. Their behaviors are sculpted through a complex interplay of temperament, early relational experiences, and unmet developmental needs. Childhood environments marked by neglect, overpraise, inconsistency, or emotional unpredictability plant seeds of insecurity, shame, and fear that become difficult to reconcile in later life. Some children learn to cope by inflating a false self, a persona that projects strength, competence, and desirability while hiding inner fragility. Others internalize shame, developing covert or vulnerable forms of narcissism, in which the struggle for self-esteem is cloaked in self-effacement, hypersensitivity, or passive aggression. Across these variations, the narcissist's behavior can be understood as a protective adaptation, a survival mechanism honed in response to emotional wounds that were too threatening to confront directly. Understanding the formation of narcissism illuminates why narcissists act as they do in adulthood. Entitlement, grandiosity, validation-seeking, lack of empathy, and compulsive control are not simply moral failings or conscious choices. They are defensive strategies designed to preserve a fragile sense of self. The mask, whether grandiose, covert, communal, or malignant, serves a vital purpose. It protects the inner self from exposure, shame, and the overwhelming vulnerability that the narcissist cannot tolerate. It is a carefully constructed facade, often highly effective, but inevitably imperfect. Crisis, exposure, or relational rupture can crack the mask, revealing glimpses of the fragility beneath, and offering rare opportunities for insight, growth, or change. Yet, while empathy for the narcissist's inner wounds is necessary for understanding, it must not come at the expense of recognizing the real harm they inflict on others. Narcissistic behavior has profound consequences for those in proximity. Partners, family members, colleagues, and friends can experience manipulation, emotional abuse, gaslighting, and betrayal. These effects are cumulative, shaping relational dynamics, self-perception, and emotional resilience long after the narcissist has departed. Awareness of these dynamics is critical for survival, recovery, and the prevention of repeated harm. Recognizing patterns, understanding motivations, and identifying red flags are not acts of cynicism but acts of self-preservation and clarity. Knowledge empowers individuals to navigate relationships with discernment, maintain boundaries, and protect their emotional well-being. The importance of emotional boundaries cannot be overstated. Boundaries are the armor and scaffolding that allow survivors of narcissistic abuse to reclaim their identity, assert autonomy, and engage in relationships on their own terms. Establishing clear limits is not an act of cruelty or defensiveness, it is an act of self-respect and recognition of one's intrinsic worth. Emotional boundaries provide a framework within which healing, clarity, and personal growth can occur. They prevent the reactivation of trauma bonds, reduce susceptibility to manipulation, and reinforce the internal sense of agency that narcissistic abuse often erodes. Developing boundaries is both a protective and restorative act, laying the groundwork for a life that is no longer dictated by the whims, moods, or manipulations of others. Healing from narcissistic abuse is a multi-layered process, requiring patience, self-compassion, and deliberate effort. Victims must first acknowledge the reality of the abuse, disentangle themselves from distorted narratives, and process the layers of grief, shame, and confusion imposed by the narcissist. Rebuilding self-esteem, identity, and personal agency is central to recovery. This involves reconnecting with authentic desires, cultivating supportive relationships, and reclaiming the emotional and psychological space that the narcissist had undermined. Education, therapy, mindfulness, and peer support are invaluable tools in this journey, helping survivors internalize self-worth, understand relational dynamics, and develop the resilience necessary to thrive independently. One of the most empowering realizations for survivors is understanding the mechanisms behind narcissistic behavior. Recognizing why narcissists act as they do, the fragility beneath the mask, the protective function of entitlement and control, the compulsive need for validation, offers clarity and perspective. This understanding is transformative. It shifts the narrative from self-blame to informed awareness. Survivors can perceive manipulation and abuse for what it is, rather than internalizing it as personal deficiency. Insight dismantles the confusion, self-doubt, and emotional dependency that narcissistic relationships often engender, allowing individuals to engage with the world more confidently, assertively, and authentically. Equally important is the cultivation of compassion, for oneself and, when appropriate, for the narcissist. Compassion does not mean condoning abuse or excusing harm. Rather, it is an acknowledgement of human complexity, a recognition that destructive behavior often arises from deep-seated wounds, fear, and inadequacy. For survivors, cultivating compassion for themselves mitigates internalized guilt, reinforces self-worth, and supports emotional healing. For the narcissist, understanding the roots of their behavior can contextualize but not justify the harm inflicted. This dual awareness fosters clarity, reduces entanglement in reactive emotional patterns, and promotes conscious decision-making about how to engage or disengage from toxic dynamics. Breaking cycles of narcissistic abuse is both a personal and relational imperative. Awareness, boundaries, and emotional resilience create a protective shield against future harm, while allowing survivors to reclaim autonomy and redefine their relational narratives. These measures are not defensive in a negative sense. They are proactive, empowering, and transformative. They allow individuals to reconstruct their lives with intentionality, choosing relationships that reinforce growth, respect, and authenticity, rather than repeating patterns of trauma or manipulation. Awareness also extends beyond the individual to societal and familial contexts, helping to interrupt generational cycles of neglect, conditional love, or emotional exploitation that often give rise to narcissistic patterns. The ultimate takeaway of understanding narcissism, for both survivors and society at large, is multifaceted. First, it fosters empathy and insight, Recognizing that narcissistic behavior is deeply rooted in unmet needs and emotional injury does not excuse harm but contextualizes it. Second, it empowers survivors. Awareness of patterns, red flags, and manipulative strategies equips individuals to protect themselves, reclaim identity, and engage in healthier relationships. Third, it reveals fundamental truths about human psychology, that fragility often masquerades as strength, that coping mechanisms can both protect and harm, and that resilience is cultivated through awareness, reflection, and intentional action. Understanding narcissism illuminates the hidden wounds of human development and underscores the potential for growth, insight, and emotional empowerment even in the face of relational trauma. In practical terms, the journey from entanglement with a narcissist toward clarity and inner strength involves several intertwined processes. Survivors must reclaim their narrative, restoring coherence to a story disrupted by manipulation and abuse. They must rebuild trust in their perceptions, feelings, and judgment, counteracting the gaslighting and distortion often imposed by the narcissist. They must develop relational literacy, learning to distinguish healthy dynamics from toxic ones, and establishing boundaries that protect emotional integrity. And they must nurture their inner life, cultivating self-compassion, resilience, and the capacity to experience joy, connection, and authenticity, independently of external validation. At the heart of this process is the realization that narcissistic behavior, as bewildering or harmful as it may appear, is ultimately a response to human vulnerability. The mask, the performance, the manipulation, all are attempts to manage fear, shame, and inadequacy. While the impact on others can be severe, understanding the underlying psychology transforms fear and confusion into knowledge and empowerment. Recognizing the mechanisms behind narcissistic behavior enables survivors to engage with the world not reactively but consciously, breaking patterns of dependence, enabling or self-doubt. Knowledge becomes a tool for liberation, insight a source of strength, and awareness a pathway to personal sovereignty. This journey is also a testament to human resilience. Survivors of narcissistic abuse often emerge with heightened emotional intelligence, clearer relational boundaries, and deeper self-understanding. They learn to recognize patterns, trust their instincts, and engage in relationships with discernment and courage. Healing is rarely linear. Setbacks and emotional turbulence are inevitable. Yet the very act of reclaiming agency, reconstructing identity, and cultivating inner strength demonstrates the capacity to overcome profound relational disruption and emerge transformed. In this sense, the story of narcissistic abuse and recovery is not only one of trauma, but also one of empowerment, growth, and the reclamation of human dignity. Ultimately, the truth behind the mask is both sobering and illuminating. Narcissists are shaped by wounds, fears, and survival strategies, yet their actions have real consequences for those around them. Survivors are not powerless. They possess the capacity to understand, protect, and heal themselves. Awareness, boundaries, and intentionality are the pillars of recovery, providing both clarity and resilience. By recognizing patterns of narcissism, understanding the motivations beneath the mask, and cultivating emotional strength, individuals can break cycles of abuse, reclaim their identity, and navigate the world with autonomy and insight. In closing, understanding narcissism is an act of both compassion and self-preservation. It allows us to see the humanity and vulnerability beneath the mask, while simultaneously empowering us to safeguard our well-being, assert our boundaries, and pursue lives rooted in authenticity and self-respect. It teaches that human wounds, when recognized and addressed, do not have to dictate the trajectory of our relationships or our sense of self. By illuminating the hidden truths of narcissism, this book has aimed to provide readers with knowledge, clarity, and practical guidance, tools that enable healing, foster insight, and nurture the inner strength necessary to navigate a world in which both fragility and resilience coexist. The journey toward understanding, healing, and empowerment is ongoing, but the path begins with awareness. Recognizing the forces that shape narcissistic behavior, the impact of abuse, and the necessity of boundaries, allows survivors to step into a life defined not by manipulation, shame, or dependence, but by insight, agency, and emotional clarity. In the end, understanding the narcissist is not only about seeing the mask for what it is about reclaiming the self that has been overshadowed, asserting one's worth, and cultivating the resilience to thrive in the face of human complexity. It is about transforming trauma into awareness, confusion into clarity, and vulnerability into strength, a testament to the enduring capacity of the human spirit to heal, grow, and reclaim its authenticity. Thank you for reading this book. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to leave us a review. Margaret Light. Disclaimer. This book was created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. While every effort has been made to ensure the accuracy and relevance of the content, readers should note that the ideas and perspectives presented are generated by AI and should not be considered professional advice. Readers are encouraged to apply their own judgment and consult experts where needed.